Chapter 26. In So Harbour as it happened, Nold, who had had to remain to hold the gateway open till Canean and the Gildan were through, had placed the hole in the air very close to where he aimed. He and Kanan caught up at a gallop, just as Pin topped a rise, and drew rein with a ton of So Harbour in front of him on the other side of a small river, crossed by a pair of arching timber bridges. Pin was no soldier, but he knew right away why Masema had left this place alone. Hard against the river, the town had two massive stone walls dotted with towers around it, the inner rising taller than. The outer, a pair of barges were tied to a long wharf that ran along the river wall from bridge to bridge. Yet the wide bridge gates, iron-strapped and closed tight, seemed to be the only openings in that expanse of rough grey stone, and battlements topped the whole length of it, built to hold off greedy neighbouring nobles. So Harbour would have had little fear of the Prophet's rabble, even if they came by thousands. Anyone wanting to break into this town would need siege engines and patience, and Masema was more comfortable terrorizing villages and towns without walls or defenses. "Well, it's glad I am to see people on the walls over there." Nell said, "I was beginning to think everyone in this country was dead and buried." He sounded only half joking, and his grin looked forced, as long as they're alive enough to sell grain. Carrion murmured in his nasal-bored voice, unbuckling his silvery white-bloomed helmet. He lifted it down to the tall pummel of his saddle. His eyes swept past and paused briefly on Barlane before he twisted around to address the eyes in the same weary tone. "Are we going to sit here or go down?" Barlane arched an eyebrow at him, a dangerous look as a man with any brains would see. Jaren did not see Pin's hackles were still trying to stand the more so since seeing the town. Maybe it was just the part of him that was wolf-disliking walls, but he did not think so. The people atop the walls pointed toward them, and some held looking-glasses. Those at least would be able to make out the banners clearly. Everyone would be able to see the soldiers with the streamers on their lances, floating on a morning breeze, and the first few carts of the line that stretched down the road out of their sight. Maybe everyone from the farms was crowded into the town. "We didn't come here to sit," he said. Barlane and Anura between them had laid out how to approach. So Harbour, the local lord or lady, had surely heard of Shaido depredations not many miles to the north of them, and they might have heard of the Prophet's presence in Alara too. Either thing was enough to make anyone wary together. They might be enough to make people loose arrows and wait till after to ask who they had shot. In any case, it was highly unlikely they would welcome outland soldiers through their gates. At the moment, the lancers remained spread along the rise, a show that these visitors possessed some armed might, even if they chose not to employ it. Not so that So Harbour would be overly impressed by 100 men, but the burnished armour of the Gildanon and the red armour of the winged guards said the visitors were not wandering tricksters. The two riversmen would impress no one until they used their bows, so they remained back with the carts to hold up the cart drivers' spirits. It was all an elaborate bit of nonsense fluff and feathers, but Pan was a country blacksmith, no matter who called him Lord the First of Mayan, and Anadai should know what they were about in a thing like this. Galen led the way down to the river at a slow walk, bright crimson helmet resting on his saddle. His back straight Pin and Berlane rode a little way behind with Idid between them and Missouri and Anura. To either side the eyes had eye with their hoods thrown back, so anyone on those walls who could recognize an Aes Sedai face would have the opportunity to see three. Aes Sedai were welcomed most places. Even where people really would rather not at their backs came all four bannerman-men, with the waters spaced among them, in their eye-wrenching cloaks, and Kieran with his shining helmet, balanced on his thigh, sore-mouthed at being relegated to riding with the waters, and now and then glaring coldly down his nose at Balweir, who trailed at the rear with his two companions. No one had told Ball where he could come, yet no one had said he could not. He bobbed a bow, whenever the nobleman looked at him, then went back to studying the town walls ahead. Baron could not shake his uneasiness as they drew nearer the town. The horses' hooves clattered hollowly on the southernmost bridge, a wide structure that rose high enough above the swift-flowing river to let a barge like those tied to the wharf pass easily underneath on sweeps. Neither of the broad, bluff-bowed craft had any provision for stepping a mast. One of those barges had settled deep in the water, slanting against taut mooring ropes, and the other somehow looked abandoned too. A rank sour smell in the air made him rub at his nose. No one else seemed to notice near the foot of the bridge. Galen drew up the closed gates, covered with black iron straps, a foot wide would have forced a pause anyway. "We have heard of the troubles plaguing this land," he bellowed at the men atop the wall, managing formality at the top of his lungs. "But we are merely passing through, and we come for trade, not trouble to buy grain and other needful things, not to fight. I have the honor to announce Berlin, Sir Pan Drag Perron, first of my and blessed of the light defender of the waves high, seat of House Perron, come to speak with the lord or lady of this land. I have the honor to announce PN to Bashir Bar. He tossed in Lord of the Two Rivers for Pin, and several other titles that Pin had no more right to, and had never heard before, then went on for the eyes, giving each the full honorific and adding her AA as well. It was a very impressive recital. When he fell silent, there was silence in the crenellations above. Dirty-faced men exchanged bleak looks and fierce whispers, shifting crossbows and polearms nervously. Only a few wore helmets, or any sort of armor. Most were in rough coats, but on one man Pan thought he saw what might have been silk under a layer of grime. It was hard to tell with so much caked dirt. Even his ears could not make out what they were saying. "How do we know you're alive?" a hoarse voice shouted down at last. Elayne blinked in surprise, but no one laughed. It was fool talk. Yet, Pan thought the hair on the back of his neck really was standing stiff. Something was very wrong here. The Aes Sedai seemed not to sense it. Then again, I said I could hide anything behind those smooth masks of cool serenity, the beads in. Anura's thin braids clicked faintly as she shook her head. Missouri ran an icy gaze along the men on the wall. "If I must prove I am alive, you will regret it," Siona denounced loudly, in crisp Cayenne accents, a little more heated than her face suggested. "If you continue to point that crossbow at me, you will regret it even more." Several of the men hastily raised their crossbows to point at the sky. Not all, though more whispers rustled along the top of the wall, but someone must have recognized. I said, "I at last." The gates squealed open on massive rusty hinges. A gagging stench swept out of the town. The stink Pan had been smelling only stronger. Old dirt and old sweat, decaying mittens and chamber pots too long, and emptied Pan's ears tried to lie back. Galen half lifted his red helmet, as if to replace it on his head before urging his dun through the gate's pin-booted stair, to follow, easing his axe in its belt loop. Just inside the gate, a filthy man in a torn coat poked Pan's leg with a finger, then darted back when Styr snapped at him. The fellow had been fat once, but his coat sagged and his skin hung loose. "Just wanted to be sure," he muttered, scratching his side absently. "My lord," he added a tick late. His eyes seemed to focus on Pan's face for the first time, and his scratching fingers froze. Golden yellow eyes were not a common sight after all. "Do you see many dead men walking?" Pin asked wryly, trying to make a joke of it as he patted the bay's neck. A trained warrior wanted to be rewarded for protecting his rider. The fellow flinched as if the horse had bared his teeth at him again. His mouth twitched into a rectus smile, and he edged sideways until he bumped solidly into Barlane's mare. Galen was right behind her, still looking ready to don his helmet, his one eye trying to watch 6 ways at once. "Where can I find your lord or lady?" she demanded impatiently. Mayan was a small nation, but Berlin was unaccustomed to being ignored. "Everyone else seems to have gone mute, but I heard you use your tongue." "Well, man, speak up." The fellow stared up at her, licking his lips. "Lord Cowan, Lord Colin is away, my lady." His eyes darted toward Pan, then flickered away. "The grain merchants there who you want, they can always be found at the Golden Barge that way." He thrust out a hand, pointing vaguely deeper into the town, then suddenly scrambled away, looking back over his shoulder at them, as though fearful of pursuit. "I think we should find somewhere else." Parents said that fellow had been afraid of more than yellow eyes. This place felt askew. "We are already here and there is nowhere else," Barlane replied in a very practical tone. In all that stink he could not catch her scent. He would have to go by what he heard and saw, and her face was calm enough for an ice to die. "I have been in towns that smelled worse than this, Baron, I'm sure I have, and if this Lord Colin is gone, it won't be the first time I've dealt with merchants. You don't really believe they've seen the dead walking, do you?" What was a man to say to that, without sounding a pure woolhead? In any case, the others were already crowding through the gates, though not in any neat array now. Winter and Alhara healed, sunded like mismatched guard dogs, though one fair the other dark, and both ready to rip out throats at the blink of an eye. They certainly had the feel of So Harbour Kirkland, riding beside Masuri, looked unwilling to wait for that eye to blink. His hand rested on the hilt of his sword. Kieran had a hand to his nose and a glare in his eye that said someone was going to pay for making him smell this Madorian. Lean looked ill too, but Ball were merely peered about, tilting his head, then drew the pair of them off into a narrow side street leading north, as Barlane said they were there already. The colourful banners looked decidedly out of place as Parn rode through the cramped, winding streets of the town. Some of the streets were actually quite wide for the size of So Harbour, but they felt close, as if the stone buildings on either side somehow loomed higher than their 2 or 3 stories and were about to topple on his head to boot imagination. Made the streets seem dim too. It had to be imagination. The sky was, not that grey people filled the dirty stone paving, but not enough to account for all the farms in the area being abandoned, and everyone skewered heads down, not hurrying towards something hurrying away. No one looked at anyone else with a river practically on their doorsteps. They had forgotten how to wash too. He did not see a face without a coating of grime or a garment that did not look to have been worn for a week, and hard work in muck with it. The stink only worsened the deeper into the town they rode. He supposed you could get used to anything in time. Worst of all was the quiet, though villages were quiet sometimes, if not so still as the woods. But a town always had a faint murmur, the sound of shopkeepers bargaining and people going about their lives. So Harbour did not even whisper it. Barely seemed to breathe. Getting better directions was difficult, since most people darted away if spoken to, but eventually they dismounted in front of a prosperous-appearing inn, 3 stories of neatly dressed greystone under a slate roof with a sign hanging out front, announcing the Golden Barge. The sign even had a touch of gilt in the lettering and on the grain mounted high in the barge, and uncovered as it never would be for shipping. No grooms appeared from the stable yard beside the inn, so the bannerman had to serve as horseholders, a task that did not make them happy. Todd put so much attention into peering at the flow of dirty people that skewered by and fondling the hilt of his short sword that Ster very nearly got a couple of his fingers when he took the stallion's reins. The mayor and the Gildan seemed to be wishing they had lances rather than banners. Flange just looked wild-eyed. In spite of the morning sun, the light did seem shadowy. Going inside did not make things any better. At first glance, the common room bore the inn's prosperity, with polished round tables and proper chairs. Instead of benches, standing beneath a high, stout-beamed ceiling, the walls were painted with fields of barley and oats and millet, ripening under a bright sun, and a colourfully painted clock stood on the carved mantel above a wide fireplace of white stone. The fireplace was cold, though the air nearly as icy as outside. The clock had run down, and the polished, dull dust lay on everything. The only people in the room were 6 men and 5 women huddling over their drinks around an oval table larger than the rest that stood in the middle of the floor. One of the men leaped to his feet with an oath face paling underneath the dirt. When PN and the others entered, a plump woman with lank, greasy hair shoved her pewter cup to her mouth and tried to gulp so fast that wine spilled over her chin. Maybe it was his eyes, maybe what happened in this town. Anura said firmly, tossing back her cloak as though a fire blazed on the hearth. The calm gaze she ran across the people at the table froze every one of them abruptly. Parn realized that neither Masuri nor Sionid had followed him inside. He doubted very much that they were waiting in the streets with the horses. What they and their warders were doing was any man's guess. The man who had jumped up tugged at his coat collar with a finger. The coat had been fine blue wool once, with a row of gilded buttons to his neck, but he appeared to have been spilling food down the front of it for some time, maybe more than had gone into him. He was another whose skin hung slack. "What happened?" I said. "I smeared." "Be quiet, Michael," a haggarded woman said quickly. Her dark dress was embroidered on the high neck and along the sleeves, but dirt made the colors uncertain. Her eyes were sunk in pits. "What makes you think something happened?" I said. Anura would have continued, but stepped in as the eyes opened her mouth again. "We are looking for the grain merchants." Anura's expression never changed, but her mouth snapped shut with an audible click. Long looks passed between the people around the table. The haggarded woman studied Anura for a moment, quickly passing on to Berlin and obviously taking in the silks and fire drops and the diadem. She spread her skirts in a curtsy. "We are the Merchants' Guild of So Harbour, my lady. What's left of breaking off?" She took a deep, shuddering breath. "I am Rahima Arnan, my lady, "How may we serve you?" The merchants seemed to brighten a little on learning that their visitors had come for grain and other things that they could supply: oil for lamps and cooking beans and needles and horseshoe nails, cloth and candles, and a dozen things more that the camp needed. At least they grew a little. Less fearful, any ordinary merchant hearing the list Barlin gave would have been hard-pressed not to smile greedily, but this lot, Mistress Aaron shouted for the innkeeper to bring wine, the best wine, quickly, now quickly. But when a long-nosed woman stuck her head hesitantly into the common room, Mistress Arnon had to rush over and catch her soiled sleeve to keep her from vanishing again. The fellow in the food-stained coat called for someone named Sparrow to bring the sample jars, but after shouting 3 times with no response, he gave a nervous laugh and darted into a back room to return a moment later, his arms around 3 large cylindrical wooden containers that he sat on the table, still laughing nervously. The others wore a collection of twitching smiles as they bowed and curtsied Barlane to a seat at the head of the oval table, greasy-faced men and women scratching at themselves without appearing to notice what they were doing. Parn tucked his gauntlets behind his belt and stood against a painted wall, watching. They had agreed to leave the bargaining to Barilyn, she was willing to admit, reluctantly, that he knew more of horseflesh than she. But she had negotiated treaties covering the sale of years' worth of the oilfish harvest. Anura had smiled thinly at the suggestion that a jumped-up country lad might take a hand. She did not call him that. She could lord him as smoothly as Missouri Orionid, yet it was clear she thought some things clearly above his ability. She was not smiling, now standing behind Barlane and studying the merchants as if to memorize their faces. The innkeeper brought wine in pewter cups that had last seen a polishing cloth weeks ago, if not months, but Parn only peered into his and swirled it in the cup. Mistress Vadia, the innkeeper, had dirt under her fingernails and embedded in her knuckles like part of her skin. He noticed that Galen, standing with his back to the opposite wall and one hand on his sword hilt, only held his cup too, and Burling never touched hers. Jeren sniffed at his, then drank deeply, and called for Mistress Vadia to bring him a picture-thin stuff to be called your best. He told the woman through his nose and looking down it, but it might wash away. The stink. She stared at him blankly, then fetched a tall Peter pitcher to his table. Without saying a word, Keon apparently took her silence for respect. Master Crossan, the fellow in the food-stained coat, unscrewed the tops of the wooden containers and spilled out hulled samples of the grain they had to offer in piles on the table. Yellow millet and brown oats, the barley only a little darker brown. There would have been no rain before the harvest, the finest quality, as you can see. He said, yes, the finest. The smile slid off Mistress Arnon's face and she jerked it. Back, we sell only the finest for people touting their wares. As the finest, they did not seem to bargain very hard. Parent had watched men and women back home selling the wool clip and the tobacco to merchants down from Boulogne, and they always disparaged the buyers' offers, sometimes complaining the merchants were trying to beggar them when the price was twice what it had been the year before, or even suggesting they might wait till next year to sell it all. It was a dance as intricate as any at a feast day. I suppose we might lower the price further for such a large quantity, a balding man told Beryline, scratching at his grey-streaked beard. It was cut short and greasy enough to cling close to his chin. Pin wanted to scratch his own beard, just watching the fellow. It's been a hard winter, a round-faced woman muttered. Only 2 of the other merchants bothered to frown at her parent, set his wine cup down on a nearby table, and walked over to the gathering in the middle of the room. Anura gave him one sharp warning glance, but several of the merchants looked at him curiously and cautiously. Galen had made his introductions all over again, but these folk were not entirely clear where Mayan was exactly, or how powerful, and the 2 rivers only meant good tobacco to them. 2 rivers. Tobacco was known everywhere. If not for the presence of an eye to eye, his eyes might have set them running. Everyone fell silent as Parent scooped up a handful of millet, the tiny spheres smooth and vivid yellow on his palm. This grain was the first clean thing he had seen in the town, letting the grain spill back onto the table. He picked up the lid of one of the containers. The threads cut into the wood were sharpened. Unworn, the lid would fit tightly. Mistress Arnon's eyes slid away from his, and she licked her lips. I want to see the grain in the warehouses, he said. Half the people around the table twitched. Mistress Arnon drew herself up, blustering. We don't sell what we don't have. You can watch our laborers load every sack on your carts if you wish to spend hours in the cold. I was about to suggest a visit to a warehouse Elayne put in, rising. She drew her red gloves from behind her belt and began tugging them on. I would never buy grain without seeing the warehouse mistress. Arnon sagged. The bald-headed man put his head down on the table. No one said anything. Though the dispirited merchants did not bother to fetch their cloaks before leading them into the street, the breeze had picked up to a wind cold, as only a late winter wind could be when people were already thinking ahead to spring, but they did not seem to notice the hunch of their shoulders had nothing to do with cold. "Can we go now, Lord Perrin?" Flynn asked, anxiously when Perrin and the others appeared. "This place makes me want a bath." Anura gave him a frown in passing that made him flinch like one of the merchants. Flynn tried a placating smile on her, but it was a sickly effort and too late for anything but her back. "As soon as I can arrange it." Pin said the merchants were already scurrying down the street, heads down and not looking at anyone. Elayne and Anura managed to follow without appearing to rush, gliding along, one as composed as the other two fine ladies out for a stroll. And never mind the filth underfoot or the stink in the air or the dirty people who started at the side of them, and sometimes all but ran away as fast as they could. Galen had finally donned his helmet and openly held his sword, held with both hands ready to draw. Garen was carrying his helmet on his hip, his other hand occupied with his wine cup, contemptuously eyeing the grimy-faced folk who hurried by. He sniffed at the wine as if it were a ponder to fight off the stench of the town. The warehouses were located on a stone-paved street, barely wider than a wagon between the town's two walls. The smell was better there, close to the river, but the wind-blown street was empty except for Perrin and the others. There was not even a stray dog to be seen. Dogs disappeared when a town grew hungry, but why would a town with enough grain to sell be hungry? Baron pointed to a two-story warehouse chosen at random. No different from any other. A windowless stone building with a wide pair of wooden doors held shut by a wooden bar that could have done for a ceiling beam at the Golden Barge. The merchants suddenly recalled that they had forgotten to bring men to lift the bars they offered to go back for them. The Lady Elayne and Aes Sedai could rest in front of the fire at the Golden Barge. While workmen were fetched, they were sure Mistress Vadier would lay a fire. Their tongues went still when Perrin placed his hand beneath the thick beam and shoved it up, out of the wooden brackets. The thing was heavy, but he backed up with it to give him room to turn and toss it down the street with a crash. The merchants stared. This might have been the first time they had ever seen a man in a silk coat do anything that could be called work. Kieran rolled his eyes and took another sniff at his wine. "Lanterns," Mistress Arn said weakly. "We'll need lanterns or torches if a ball of light appeared floating above Anura's hand, glowing bright enough in the grey morning to cast everyone in faint shadows in the paving and the stone walls." Some of the merchants put hands up to shield their eyes. After a moment, Master Crossan tugged one of the doors open by an iron ring. The smell inside was the familiar sharp scent of barley, almost strong enough to overcome the stench of the town, and something more small dim shapes slunk. Away into the shadows ahead of Anura's light, he could have seen better without it, or at least deeper into the darkness. The glowing ball cast a large pool of light and walled off what lay beyond. He smelled cat closer to feral than not, and rat too. A sudden squeal in the black depths of the warehouse, suddenly cut off, spoke of cat meeting rat. There were always rats in grain, barns and cats to hunt them. It was comforting and normal, almost enough to soothe his uneasiness, almost. He smelled something else, a smell he should know, a fierce yowl deep in the warehouse turned to rising cries of pain that died abruptly. Apparently the rats of So Harbour sometimes hunted back. Parents' hackles stirred again, but surely there was nothing here the Dark One would want to spy on. Most rats were just rats. There was no need to go very far. In coarse sacks filled the darkness in high slant-sided stacks on low wooden platforms to keep the stacks off the stone floor, rows and rows of stacks piled nearly to the ceiling, and likely the same on the floor above. If not, this building still held enough grain to feed his people for weeks. Walking to the nearest stack, he drove his belt knife into a pale brown sack and sliced down through the tough jute fibers. A flood of barley corns spilled out and clear in the glow of Anura's brilliant light. Wriggling black specks, weevils, almost as many as there were barleys. Their scent was sharper than that of the barley weevils. He wished the hair on his neck would stop trying to rise. The cold should have been enough to kill weevils that one sack was proof, and his nose knew the smell of weevils now, but he moved to another stack, then another, and another each time, slicing open one sack. Each released a spill of pale brown barley and black weevils. The merchants were standing huddled together in the doorway, daylight behind them, but Anura's light cast their faces in sharp relief. Worried faces, despairing faces. "We would be most happy to winnow each sack we sell," Mistress Arnon said unsteadily. "For only a slight additional. For half the last price I offered," Elayne cut in, sharply wrinkling her nose in disgust. She moved her skirts clear of the weevils scuttling among the grain in the floor. "You will never get." "All of them, and no millet," Pien said grimly. His men needed food, and so did the soldiers, but the millet grains were hardly bigger than the weevils' winnow. As they would, he would bring back weevils and millet in equal weight. "We'll take extra beans instead." But they get winnowed too suddenly, someone shrieked outside in the street. Not a cat or a rat, but a man in terror. Perrin did not even realize he had drawn his axe until he found the haft in his hand. As he pushed through the merchants in the doorway, they huddled closer together, licking their lips and not even trying to see who had screamed. Tuon was backed up against the wall of a warehouse across the way. His shining helmet with the white plume lying on the pavement beside his wine cup. The man's sword was half out of the scabbard, but he seemed frozen, staring with bulging eyes at the wall of the building. Parn had just come out of Perrin touched his arm and he jumped. "There was a man," the Gildan said uncertainly. "He was just there." He looked at me, and Kanan scrubbed a hand over his face. Despite the cold, sweat glistened on his forehead. He walked through the wall. "He did you. Must believe me." Someone moaned, one of the merchants, Parn thought. "I saw the man too," Sean had said behind him, and it was his turn to give a start. His nose was useless in this place, giving the wall Curan had indicated a last glance. The eyes stepped away from it with a palpable unwillingness. Her warders were tall men towering over her, but they stayed only far enough away to gain room to draw their swords. Though what the grim-eyed warders were to fight if Seonid was serious, Perrin could not imagine. "I find it difficult to lie, Lord Pin," Seonid said dryly when he expressed doubt. But her tone quickly became as serious as her face, and her eyes were so intense that they alone began to make Parn feel uneasy. "The dead are walking in, so Harbour Lord Colin fled the town for fear of his wife's spirit. It seems there was doubt as to how she died. Hardly a man or woman in the town has not seen someone dead, and a good many have seen more than one. Some say people have died from the touch of someone dead. I cannot verify that, but people have died of fright and others because of it. No one goes out at night in So Harbour or walks into a room unannounced. People strike out at shadows and surprises with whatever is to hand, and sometimes they have found a husband, wife or neighbour dead at their feet. This is not hysteria or a tale to frighten children. Lord Baron, I have never heard of the like, but it is real. You must leave one of us here to do what we can." Pon shook his head slowly. He could not afford to lose an Aes Sedai. If he was to free Phil, Mistress Arnhem began to weep, even before he said, "So Harbour will have to face its dead alone." But fear of the dead only explained so much. Maybe people were too frightened to think of washing. But it seemed unlikely that fear would take everyone that way. They just did not seem to care anymore, and weevils thriving in winter in freezing cold. There was worse wrong in So Harbour than spirits walking, and every instinct told him to leave at a dead run without looking back. He purely wished that he could. Chapter 27. What must be done? The winnowing took place on a snowy eastern riverbank, where there was nothing to cut the sharp north wind. Men and women from the town hauled sacks across the bridges in 4 horse wagons and 1-horse carts. Even barrows, pushed by hand. Normally buyers brought their own wagons to the warehouses, or at worst the grain and dried beans only had to be carried as far as the wharf. But Perrin had no intention of sending his cart drivers into So Harbour, or anyone else for that matter. Whatever was wrong in that town might be catching anyway. The drivers were uneasy enough, as it was, frowning at the dirty town's folk people who never spoke but laughed nervously when they accidentally met someone's eye. The grimy-faced merchants overseeing the work were no better in the drivers. Native Kyrie merchants were clean, respectable people, at least outwardly, who very seldom twitched just because someone moved at the corner of their vision between merchants, with a tendency to peer suspiciously at anyone they did not know, and townsfolk who dragged their feet, recrossing the bridges, clearly reluctant to go back inside their own walls. The cart drivers were right on edge. They gathered in little clusters, pale, dark-clad men and women, gripping the hilts of their belt knives and peering at the taller locals as if at murderous madmen Pin rode about, slowly watching the winnowing, examining the row of carts that stretched up the rise and out of sight, waiting to be loaded, or the town's wagons and carts and barrows rolling across the bridges. He made sure he was in plain view. He was not sure why the sight of him pretending to be unconcerned should settle anyone else's nerves. Yet it seemed to enough that no one started running. At least though they continued to look askance at the people of So Harbor, they kept their distance too, and just as well. Let the notion that some of those folk might not be alive get into the Kainen's heads and half would whip up their cart horses to flee. Then and there most of the rest might not wait much past dark. That sort of tale could twist anyone's head come night. The one sun, nearly hidden by grey overcast, still sat less than halfway to its noonday peak. Yet increasingly it was obvious they would have to be there through the night. Maybe more than one. His jaw nodded with the effort of not grinding his teeth, and even Neild began to avoid his scowls. He did not snap at anyone he just wanted. It was an arduous process. The winnowing, every last sack had to be opened and emptied onto large flat wicker baskets, each of which took 2 people to toss the grainer beans. The cold wind carried away weevils in a shower of black flecks, and men and women with woven 2-handed fans added to the gusts. A swift current swept away everything that was blown into the river. But soon the snow in the riverbank was trampled underfoot, and the grey slush, layered with insects, dead or dying from the cold, and a liberal coating of oats and barley speckled with red beans. There was always a new layer to replace what feet mashed into the snow. What was left in the basket seemed cleaner, though if not entirely clean when it was poured back into the coarse jute bags, which had been turned inside out and beaten fiercely with sticks by children to shake out vermin. The refilled sacks went into the Keenan's carts as soon as the tops were tied, but the piles of empty bags grew at a prodigious rate. He was leaning on the pommel of Stair's saddle, trying to calculate whether it was taking 2 whole cartloads from the warehouse to fill one of his carts with grain when Barlane brought her white mare up beside him, holding her scarlet cloak close against the wind. With one red-gloved hand, Anura reined in a few paces away, her ageless face, smooth and unreadable. The eyes appeared to be giving them privacy, yet she was close enough to hear anything above whispers, even without any tricks of the power-smooth face, or no, her beak of a nose gave her a predatory look. Today, her beaded braids seemed some strange eagle's lowered crest. "You cannot save everyone," Barlin said. Calmly away from the stink of the town, her scent was sharp with urgency and razor-edged with anger. "Sometimes you must choose. So Harbor is Lord Cowan's duty. He had no right to abandon his people." Not angry with him, then Parn frowned. Did she think he felt guilty balanced against Vil's life? The troubles of So Harbor could not budge the scales of hair, but he turned his bay so he was looking at the great town walls across the river. Not the hollowed-eyed children piling up empty sacks. A man did what he could. What he had to. "Does Anura have an opinion on what's happening here?" he growled quietly. But somehow he had no doubt the eyes that I heard. "I have little idea what Anura thinks," Barlin replied, making no effort to lower her voice. She not only did not care who overheard, she wanted to be heard. "She is not as forthcoming as she once was, as I once thought she was. It is up to her to mend what she has torn." Without looking at the eyes, she turned and rode away. Anura remained behind, eyes unblinking on PN's face. "You are Tiveran, yes, but you are still only a thread in the pattern. As am I in the end. Even the Dragon Reborn is just a thread to be woven into the pattern. Not even a Tveran thread chooses how it will be woven. Those threads are people," Perrin said wearily. "Sometimes maybe people don't want to be woven into the pattern without any say, and you think this makes a difference, not waiting on an answer." She lifted her reins and heeled her fine-ankled brown mare after Barlane in a gallop that fanned her cloak behind. She was not the only eye who wanted words with Pin. No, he told firmly after listening to her patting Stir's neck. It was the writer wanted soothing, though he wanted to be away from. So Harbor, I said no, and I mean no. She sat her saddle stiffly, a pale little woman carved of ice, except that her eyes were dark coals burning, and she wrecked of a fronted fury barely in check. Cyanided was mild as milk water with the wise ones, but he was not a wise one behind her. Alhara's dark face was a stone grey streaking his curly black hair, like Frostwinter's face was red above his curled moustaches. They had to accept what passed between their eyes and the wise ones. But Pin was not the wind whipped their water cloaks about, leaving their hands free for swords. If need be rippling in the wind, the cloaks shifted in shades of grey and brown, blue and white. It was easier on the stomach than seeing them make parts of a man disappear. Some easier if I have to. I'll send Adar to bring you back. He warned. Her face stayed cold, her eyes hot, yet a quiver ran through her, swaying the small white gem hanging on her forehead. Not from fear of what the wise ones would do to her, if she had to be brought back just from the same offense at Pan, that made her scent a hooked thorn. He was growing accustomed to offending eyes, not a habit a wise man got into, but there seemed no way out of it. "What about you?" he asked Missouri. "Do you want to stay in?" So Harbour as well. The slim woman was known for speaking straight to the point, direct as a green for all. She was brown, but she said calmly, "Would you not send Adara after me too? There are many ways to serve, and we cannot always pick the ways we would wish, which come to think might be to the point in a way." He still had no idea why she visited Massima in secret. Did she suspect that he knew Missouri's face was a bland mask? Kirkland wore a bored expression. Now they were out of. So Harbour, he managed to seem slumped while sitting his horse erect, without a worry in the world or a thought in his head. A man who believed that if Kirkland would return the next day to buy a second pig in a poke. The townsfolk worked mechanically as the sun rose higher, like people who wanted to lose themselves in the task at hand and feared the return of memories. When they stopped, Pin decided so Harbour was making him fanciful. Still, he thought he was right. The air beyond the walls still looked too dim, as though a shading cloud hung over the town. At noon, the cart drivers cleared patches of snow on the slope, rising from the river to make small fires and brew weak tea, with leaves brewing their third pot, or maybe fourth. There had been no tea to be had in the town. Some of the drivers looked at the bridges as if thinking to enter. So Harbour and see what they could find to eat, a glance at the dirt-caked people working the winnowing baskets sent them back to dig out their small bags of oatmeal and ground acorn. At least they knew that mix was clean. A few eyed the sacks already loaded on the carts, but the beans needed to be soaked and the grain run through the large hand mills that had been left back in the camp. And that was after the cooks picked out as many more weevils as they thought men could not stomach. Eating Pin had no appetite, not for the cleanest bread, but he was drinking what passed for tea from a battered tin cup when Elayne found him. The Karanan did not actually come to him. Instead, the short man in the striped dark coat rode slowly past the small fire where Pan was standing, then reined in with a frown a little up slope, dismounting. Elayne lifted his geelings near forehoof and frowned at it. Of course he did look up twice to see whether Pan was coming. With a sigh, Pin returned the dented cup to the blocky little woman. He had borrowed it from a greying cart driver, who spread her dark skirts in a curtsy and grinned and shook her head at Elayne. Likely she could sneak 10 times as well. As the fellow needled, squatting by the fire with his hands wrapped around another tin cup, laughed out loud so hard he had to wipe a tear from his eye. Maybe he was beginning to go crazy light at this place. Gave a man cheerful thoughts. Elayne straightened long enough to make Pin a leg and say, "I see you, my lord," then ducked back down to snatch up the foreleg again. Like a fool, you did not grab at a horse's legs that way, unless you wanted kicking. But then Pan expected nothing but foolishness, really. First there was Lance playing it, being Aiel with his shoulder-long hair tied off in a tail at the nape of his neck, in weak imitation of how Aiel cut theirs. And now the man was playing at being a spy. Pan rested a hand on the geeling's neck to soothe the animal after all that snatching, and put an interested look on his face as he appeared at a hoof that had absolutely nothing wrong with it, except for a nick in the shoe where the iron might break in a few days if it was not replaced. His hands itched for Friar's tools. It seemed years since he had changed a horse's shoes or worked a forge master. Balver said, "Word Lord Elayne," said softly, head down. "His friend is travelling to sell his wares, but is expected back tomorrow or the next day. He said to ask whether it will be all right if we catch up to you." Then, peering under the horse's belly at the winnowers down by the river, he added, "Though it hardly looks as if you will be away before." Pin scowled down at the winnowing. He scowled at the line of carts waiting their turn to be loaded at the Hufozen, or so, that already had their canvas covers lashed down. One of those held the first of the leather for patching boots and candles and such. No oil, though the lamp oil in So Harbour smelled as rancid as the cooking oil. What if Gaul and the maidens brought word of Phil an actual sighting? Perhaps he would give anything to talk to someone who had seen her, could tell him she was unharmed. What if the shadow began to move suddenly? Tell Balwer not to wait too long, he growled. As for me, I'll be away inside the hour. He was as good as his word. Most of the carts and drivers had to be left behind to make the one-day journey back to camp on their own, and Kanan and his green-helmeted soldiers to guard them with orders that no one was to cross the bridges. Cold died appearing completely recovered from his breakdown. The Gildanon assured him that he was fit and ready. Very likely, orders or not, he would be going back into. So Harbour, just to convince himself, he was not afraid. Pond did not waste time trying to talk him out of it. For one thing, Seon had to be found. She was not precisely hiding, yet she had learned of his departure, and leaving her waters to hold her horse quite openly. She dodged about on foot, trying to keep carts between herself and him. The pale eyes could not hide her scent, though, or if she could, she did not know it was necessary. She was surprised when he tracked her down quickly, and indignant when he marched her to her horse ahead of St. Even. So he was well under the hour riding away from So Harbour, with the winged guards making the ring of red armour around Barlane, the 2 riversmen surrounding the 8 loaded carts that trundled along behind the 3 remaining banners, and the old grinning for all he was worth. Not to mention trying to chat up the ice pond did not know what to do if the fellow really was going mad. As soon as the rise hid, So Harbour behind them, he felt the loosening of a knot he had not realized was riding between his shoulders, that left only 10 others, and a knot of impatience twisting his belly. Barlane's obvious sympathy could not loosen those. Neil's gateway took them from the snow-covered field to the small clearing of the travelling ground, amid the towering trees, 4 legs in a step, but Parn did not wait for the handful of carts to come through. He thought he heard Barlane make a vexed sound when he booted Stair to a quick trot back toward the camp. Or maybe it was one of the eyes. Much more likely there was a sense of stillness when he rode in among the 2 riversmen's tents and huts. The sun still hung not too far off overhead in the grey sky, but there were no cookpots on the fires, and very few of the men gathered around the campfires, holding their cloaks close and peering intently into the flames. A handful were sitting on the rough stools that Bancroft knew how to make the rest stood or squatted. No one so much as looked up. Certainly no one came running to take his horse. Not stillness. He realized tension. The smell somehow reminded him of a bow drawn to the point of breaking. He could almost hear the creak as he dismounted in front of the red-striped tent. Daniel appeared from the direction of the low Aiel tents, walking fast. Sulin and Adara, one of the wise ones, were following him and keeping up easily, though neither appeared to hurry. Sulin's face was a sun-dark leather. Mask Adara's, barely revealed by the dark shawl wrapped around her head, was an image of calm. Despite her bulky skirts, she made as little sound as the white-haired maiden, not so much as a faint clink from her golden ivory bracelets and necklaces. Daniel was chewing the edge of one thick moustache, absently pulling his sword an inch out of its rough leather scabbard, and shoving it back hard, pull and shove. He drew a deep breath before speaking. The maidens brought in 5 Shaido Lord Pin Arganda, took them over to the Gildan tents to put them to the question. Simmers with them. Pin brushed aside Misima's presence inside the camp. "Why did you let Aranda take them?" he asked Adara. Dan could not have stopped it, but the wise ones were a different proposition. Adara appeared not much older than Parn, yet her cool blue eyes seemed to have seen far more than he ever would. She folded her arms beneath her breasts in a rattle of bracelets, and with a touch of impatience, even Shaido know how to embrace pain. Perniara, it will take days to bring any of them to talk, and there seemed no reason to wait if Adara's eyes were cool Sulin's. "Were blue eyes my spear sisters, and I could have done it faster ourselves a little." But Denuan said, "You wanted no blows struck. Gerard Gandanda is an impatient man, and he mistrusts us." She sounded as though she would have spat if she were not Aiel. "You may not learn much. In any case, they are stone dogs. They will yield slowly and as little as possible. In this it is always necessary to put together a little from one with a little from another to make a picture. Embrace pain." There had to be pain when you put a man to the question. He had not let that thought form in his head before this. "But to get Phil back, have somebody rub Stair down," he said, roughly thrusting the reins at Denel. The Gildanon portion of the camp could not have been more different from the rude shelters and haphazardly placed tents of the two riversmen here. The peaked canvas tents stood in precise rows, most with a steel-tipped cone of lances standing at the entry flaps, and saddled horses tethered at the side, ready to mount the flicking of the horses' tails and the long streamers in. The lances lifting on a cold breeze were the only disordered things to be seen. The paths between the tents were all the same width, and a straight line could have been drawn through the rows of cook fires. Even the creases in the canvas, from where the tents had been folded away at the bottom of carts until the snows came, made straight lines, all orderly and neat. A smell of oatmeal porridge and boiled acorn hung in the air, and some green-coated men were scraping the last of the midday meal from their tin plates with their fingers. Others were already scouring out the cookpots. None showed any sign of tension. They were just eating and doing chores with about equal pleasure. It was something that had to be done. A large knot of men stood gathered in a ring near the sharpened sticks that marked the outer edge of the camp. No more than half wore the green coats and burnished breastplates of Gildan and lancers. Some of the others carried lances, or had swords belted over their rumpled coats. Those ranged from fine silk or good wool to the pickings of a rag bag. But none could be called clean except in comparison to So Harbor. You could always tell Msima's men even from the back. Another smell came to him. As he approached the circle of men, the smell of meat roasting. And there was a muffled sound that he tried not to hear. When he began pushing his way through the soldiers, looked around at him and gave way grudgingly. Msima's men started back, muttering about yellow eyes and shadow spawn. Either way, he gained passage to the front, 4 tall men, red-haired or pale in the grey and brown cotton they bound with. Their wrists lashed to their ankles in the small of their backs, and stout lengths of branch tied behind their knees and elbows. Their faces were battered and bruised, and they had watted rags tied between their teeth. The 5th man was naked, staked out between 4 stout pegs driven into the ground and stretched so tight. His senior stood out. He thrashed as much as his binding allowed, though, and howled into the rags, stuffing his mouth a muffled bellow of agony. Hot coals made a small cluster on his belly, giving off a faint smoke. It was the smell of blistering flesh that Parn's nose had caught. The coals clung to the stretched man's skin, and every time his writhing managed to throw one off a grinning fellow in a filthy green silk coat squatting beside him, he used a pair of tongs to replace it with another from a potful, melting a circle of mud in the ground. Per knew him. His name was Hari, and he liked to collect ears strung on a leather cord. Men's ears, women's ears, children's ears. It never minded to hurry without thinking. Perrin strode forward and kicked the little pile of coals off the bound man. Some of them struck Hari, who jumped back with a startled squeal that turned to a shriek. When his hand came down in the pot, he toppled over sideways, cradling his burned hand and glaring at Pin, a weasel in a human skin. The savage makes a sham. Ara, Msima said. Pin did not even notice the man standing there, face like a scowling stone beneath his shaved scalp. His dark, fevered eyes held a measure of contempt. The scent of madness skittered through the stink of burned flesh. I know them. They pretend to feel pain, but they do not the way other men do. You must be willing and able to hurt a stone to make one of them talk. Aranda, rigid beside Msima, was gripping his sword hilt so hard that his hand shook. Perhaps you are willing to lose your wife, Ibara, he girded. But I will not lose my queen. It has to be done. Arum said, half pleading, half demanding. He was on Msima's other side, clutching the edges of his green cloak as if to keep his hands from the sword on his back. His eyes were almost as hot as Msima's. You taught me that a man does what he must. Pin forced his fists to unknot what had to be done for Phil Barrel. And the Aes Sedai came pushing through the crowd, barely wrinkling her nose slightly, at the side of the man stretched out between the pegs. The three-eyed eye might have been looking at a piece of wood, for all their expression. Adara and Sulin were with them. Neither more affected. Some of the Gildanan soldiers frowned at the 2 ale women and muttered under their breath. Msima's rumpled, dirty-faced men glared at Aiel and Aes Sedai alike, but most edged away from the 3 warders, and those who did not were pulled away by their companions. Some fools knew the limits of stupidity. Msima glared at Elayne with burning eyes before deciding to pretend she did not exist. Some fools knew no limits. Bending Pin untied the rag around the pegged man's mouth and tugged the wad from between his teeth. He just managed to snatch his hand back from a snap, as vicious as any stare could have given. Immediately the eelman threw back his head and began to sing in a deep, clear voice. Wash the spears while the sun climbs high, wash the spears while the sun falls low, wash the spears who fears to die, wash the spears no one I know. Messima's laughter rose in the middle of the singing. Perrin's hackles rose too. He had never heard Messima laugh before. It was not a pleasant sound. He did not want to lose a finger, so he pulled his axe out of its belt loop and carefully used the top of the axe head against the man's chin to push his mouth shut. Eyes the color of sky looked up at him out of a sun-dark face. Unafraid, the man smiled. I don't ask you to betray your people. Baron said, his throat hurt with the effort of keeping his voice steady. You, Shaido, captured some women. All I want to know is how to get them back. One is named Phil. She's as tall as one of your women, with dark, tilted eyes, a strong nose and a bold mouth. A beautiful woman. You'd remember her if you had seen her. Have you pulling the axe away? He straightened, the shadow stared at him for a moment, then raised his head and began to sing again, never taking his eyes from Pin. It was a jolly song with the rollicking sound of a dance. I once met a man who was far from home. His eyes were yellow and his wits were stone. He asked me to hold smoke in my hand, and he said he could show me a watery land. He put his head in the ground and his feet in the air and said he could dance like a woman fair. He said he could stand till he turned to stone. When I blinked my eyes, he was gone, letting his head fall back. The shadow chuckled deep and rich. He could have been lounging at ease on a feather bed. If you can't do this, Aram said desperately, then go away. I'll help see to it. What had to be done? Pin looked at the faces around him. Arganda scowling with hatred at him, as much as the Shaido, now Messima, stinking of madness and filled with a scornful hate. You must be willing and able to hurt a stone, Adara. Her face is unreadable, as the eyes' arms folded calmly beneath her breasts. Even Shaido knew how to embrace pain. It will take days. Sulin, the scar across her cheek, still pale on her leathery skin, her gaze level, and her scent implacable. They will yield slowly, and as little as possible. Berylin smelling of judgment, a ruler who had sentenced men to death and never lost a night's sleep. What had to be done? Willing and able to hurt a stone, embrace the pain. Olight Faile the axe was as light as a feather rising in his hand, and came down like a hammer on the anvil, the heavy blade shearing through the shadow's left wrist. The man grunted in pain, then reared up convulsively with a snarl, deliberately spraying the blood that got it from his wrist across Perrin's face. Heal him, Pin said to the eyes of Ai, stepping back. He did not try to wipe his face. The blood was seeping into his beard, he felt. Hollow, he could not have lifted the axe again if he had to for his life. Are you mad? Missouri said angrily. We cannot give the man back his hand. I said heal him, he growled. Cyanided was already moving, though lifting her skirts to glide across the ground and kneel at the man's head. He was biting at his severed wrist, trying futilely to stem the flow of blood with the pressure of his teeth. But there was no fear in his eyes, or in his smell. Nun Seon had gripped the shadow's head, and suddenly he convulsed again, flinging his arm out wildly. The spray of blood dwindled as he jerked and was gone before he slumped back to the ground. Grey-faced unsteadily, he raised the stump of his left arm to look at the smooth skin that now covered the end. If there was a scar, Pin could not see it. The man bared teeth at him. He still did not smell afraid. Seon had slumped too, as if she had strained it to her limit. Alhara and Winter took a step forward, and she waved them away, rising by herself with a heavy sigh. I've been told you can hold out for days and still say next to nothing, Perrin said. His voice sounded too loud in his ears. I don't have time for you to show how tough you are or how brave. I know you're brave and tough, but my wife's been a prisoner too long. You'll be separated and asked about some women, whether you've seen them, and where that's all I want to know. There'll be no hot coals or anything else, just questions. But if anybody refuses to answer, or if your answers are too different, then everybody loses something. He was surprised to find that he could lift the axe. After all, the blade was smeared with red 2 hands and 2 feet. He said coldly light. He sounded like ice. He felt like ice to his bones. That means you get 4 chances to answer the same. And if you all hold out, I still won't kill you. I'll find a village to leave you in some place that will let you beg somewhere. The boys will toss a coin to the fierce ailman with no hands or feet, you think on it, and decide whether it's worth keeping my wife from me. Even Messima was staring at him, as if he had never seen the man standing there with an axe when he turned to go. Messima's men and the Gildan alike parted in front of him as though to let a whole fist of Trollocs through. He found the hedge of sharpened stakes in front of him and the forest 100 paces or so beyond, but he did not change direction. Carrying the axe, he walked until huge trees surrounded him, and the smell of the camp was left behind. The smell of blood he carried with him, sharpened metallic. There was no running from that. He could not have said how long he walked through the snow. He barely noticed the sharpening slant of the bars of light that sliced the shadows beneath the forest canopy. The blood was thick on his face and his beard, beginning to dry. How many times had he said he would do anything to get Faile back? A man did what he had to. For Faile anything abruptly, he raised the axe behind his head in both hands and hurled it as hard as he could. It spun end over end and slammed into the thick trunk of an oak with a solid thunk, letting out a breath that seemed locked in his lungs. He sank down on a rough stone outcrop that stuck up as high and as broad as a bench and put his elbows on his knees. "You can show yourself now, Elias," he said wearily. "I can smell you there. Can—" The other man stepped lightly out of the shadows, yellow eyes glowing faintly beneath the wide brim of his hat. The Aiel were noisy compared to him. Adjusting his long knife, he took a seat beside Perrin on the outcrop, but for a time he merely sat, combing his fingers through the grey straw beard that fanned across his chest. He nodded toward the axe stuck in the side of the oak. "I told you once to keep that, till you got to like using it too much. Did you start liking it back there?" Pin shook his head hard. "No, not that, but what, boy, I think you almost have me scared, only you smell scared too about time." He was scared of something, Perrin muttered, shrugging uncomfortably. Some things were hard to give voice. Maybe it was time to, though the axe I didn't notice it the first time. Only looking back, that was the night I met Gaul and the White Cloaks tried to kill us later. Fighting Trollocs in the 2 rivers, I wasn't sure, but then at Demise Wells I was. I'm afraid in a battle. Elias afraid and sad because maybe I'll never see Faile. Again his heart clenched till his chest hurt. Faile only. I've heard Grady and Aiel talk about how it is holding the one power. They say they feel more alive. I'm too frightened to spit in a battle, but I feel more alive than any time except when I'm holding Phil. I don't think I could stand it. If I came to feel that way about what I just did back there, I don't think Faile would have me back if I came to that." Elias snorted. "I don't think you have that in you, boy. Listen, danger takes different men in different ways. Some are cold as clockwork, but you never struck me as the cold sort when your heart starts pounding it. Heats your blood, stands to reason. It heightens your senses too. Makes you aware maybe you'll die in a few minutes, maybe in a heartbeat. But you're not dead now, and you know it from your teeth to your toenails. Just the way things are doesn't mean you'll like it." "I would like to believe that parents said simply, 'Live as long as I have,'" Elias replied in a dry voice. "And you'll believe. Till then, just take it that I've lived. Longer than you have, and I've been there before you." The two of them sat looking at the axe. Perrin wanted to believe the blood on his axe looked black now. Blood had never looked so black before. How long had it been from the angle of the light sifting through the trees? The sun was falling. His ears caught the crunch of hooves in the snow, slowly coming toward him. Minutes later, Nald and Aram appeared, the one-time tinker, pointing out tracks, and the Asherman shaking his head impatiently. It was a clear trail, but in truth Pan would not have bet on Neild being able to follow it. He was a city man. Our gender thought we ought to wait till your blood cooled. Nell said, leaning on his saddle and studying Perrin me. "I think it can't get any cooler." He nodded, a touch of satisfaction around his mouth. He was accustomed to people being afraid of him because of his black coat and what it represented. They talked, Arm said, and they all gave the same answers. His skull said. He did not like the answers. "I think the threat of leaving them to beg frightened them more than your axe, but they say they've never seen the Lady Phil or any of the others. We could try the coals again. They might remember." Then did he sound eager to find Phil or to use the coals? Elias grimaced. "They'll just give you back the answers you've already given them now. Tell you what you want to hear. It was a small chance anyway. There's thousands of Shaido and thousands of prisoners. A man could live his whole life among that many people, and never made more than a few hundred. To remember then we have to kill them," Aram said grimly. Sulin said the maidens made sure to take them when they had no weapons so they could be questioned. They won't just settle down to be Gishine. If even one escapes, he can let the Shaido know we're here, then they'll be coming after us, parents. Joints felt rusted, aching as he stood up. He could not just let the Shid go, they can be guarded. Aram haste had almost lost him. Failed completely, and he had been hasty again. Hasty, such a mild word for cutting off a man's hand. And to no purpose, he had always tried to think carefully and move carefully. He had to think now. But every thought hurt Faile was lost in a sea of white-clad prisoners. Maybe other Gashin would know where she is, he muttered, turning back toward the camp. But how to put his hands in any of the Shaido's Gishini? They were never allowed outside the camp except under guard. What about that boy? Elias asked. Pin knew what he meant without looking the axe. Leave it for whoever finds it. His voice turned harsh. Maybe some fool gleeman will make a story out of it. He strode away toward the camp, never looking back with its empty loop. The thick belt around his waist was too light, all to no purpose. 3 days later, the carts returned from So. Harbour, heavy laden, and B were entered Perrin's tent with a tall, unshaven man wearing a dirty woolen coat and a sword. Thad looked much better cared for at first. Par did not recognize him behind an untrimmed month's growth of beard. Then he caught the man's scent. "I never expected to see you again," he said. Bear blinked as much as a gasp of startlement from anyone else. Doubtless the bird-like little man had been looking forward to presenting a surprise. "I've been searching for Magdan," Dolanvor said roughly, "but the Shaido moved faster than I could master. Balworth says you know where she is." Balworth gave the younger man a sharp look, but his voice remained as dry and emotionless as his scent-master Talonbor reached So Harbour, just before I left my lord. It was the meest chance that I encountered him, but perhaps a fortunate chance he may have some allies for you. I will let him tell it. Talonvor frowned at his boots and said nothing. Allies Baron prompted nothing less than an army would be much use, but I'll take any aid you can bring. Talonvor looked at Balworth, who returned a half bow and a blandly encouraging smile. The unshaven man drew a deep breath. 15,000. Shachan near enough, most are Terrabonas actually, but they ride under. Shachan banners and they have at least a dozen demon. His voice quickened with urgency, a need to finish before Pin could cut him off. I know it's like taking help from the Dark One, but they're hunting the Shaido too, and I'd take the Dark One's help to free Merton for a moment. Pin stared at the two men, Talonfor nervously thumbing his sword hilt. B were like a sparrow waiting to see which way a cricket would hop, Shachan and Damani. Yes, that would be like taking the Dark Ones. Help sit down and tell me about the Shachan, he said. Oh, Chapter 28. A cluster of rosebuds from the day they left Abu Dudar, travelling with Volenluca's grand travelling show and magnificent display of marvels and wonders, was every bit as bad as Matt's darkest thoughts had made it. For one thing, it rained almost every day for a few hours, and once for 3 days running cold winter rain in downpours, little short of snow and icy drizzles that slowly soaked a coat through and left you shivering before you knew it. Water ran off the hard-packed road as if it had been paved in stone, leaving at worst a thin slick of mud. But that long train of wagons and horses and people covered little enough ground when the sun shone. In the beginning, the showfolk had been all eagerness to leave the city, where lightning sank ships in the night and strange murders had everyone looking over their shoulders, to be away from a jealous Seanchan nobleman who would be hunting his wife furiously and might take out his anger on anyone associated with spiriting her out of his clutches. In the beginning, they pressed ahead as fast as the horses could pull the wagons, urging the animals for a quicker step another mile, but every mile seemed to make them feel that much farther from danger, that much safer, and by the first afternoon, "Have to take care of the horses," Luca explained, watching the team unhitched from his ridiculously painted wagon and led away to the horse lines through a light drizzle. The sun still sat little more than halfway down to the horizon, but already grey tendrils were rising from the smoke holes of tents and the metal chimneys of the box-like living wagons. "Nobody's chasing us, and it's a long way to Lugard. Good horses are hard to come by and expensive." Luca gave a sour frown and shook his head. Mention of expense always soured him. He was tight with a penny, except where his wife was concerned. Not many places between here and there worth stopping more than a day. Most villages won't provide a full crowd, even if the whole population turns out, and you can never tell how a town will be until you set up. You're not paying me enough to give up what I can earn, though." Hitching his embroidered crimson cloak closer against the damp, he glanced over his shoulder toward his wagon. The smell of something bitter drifted through the light rain. Mat was not sure he would want to eat anything. Luca's wife cooked. "You're certain nobody is chasing us, right?" Coffin irritably tugging his woolen cap lower, Mat stalked away through the brightly colored sprawl of tents and wagons, grinding his teeth. Not paying enough for what he had offered. Luca should have been willing to run his animals all the way to Lugard. Well, not exactly run. He did not want to kill horses after all. But that puffed-up papai should have been willing to bloody push hard, not far from Luca's wagon. Chel Vanon was seated on a three-legged stool that he overlapped, stirring some sort of dark stew in a small kettle that hung over a small fire rain dripped into the kettle from the drooping brim of his hat. But the fat man did not seem to notice or care. Gorderon and Fergan, two of the Red Arms, grumbled curses as they drove pegs into the muddy ground for the guy ropes of the dirty brown canvas tent they shared with Harnan and Metwin and with Vanon too, but Vanon possessed skills that he considered put him above raising tents, and the Red Arms agreed with only a little reluctance Vanon was an experienced friar, but more importantly, he was the best tracker and the best horse thief in the country. Unlikely as that seemed to look at him, and you could name the country you chose. Fergan caught sight of Mat and bit off an oath as his hammer missed the tent peg and hit his thumb, dropping the hammer. He stuck the thumb in his mouth and squatted there complaining shrilly, "Around it we're going to have to be out on this all night guarding those women. My lord, can't you hire some of those horse handlers to do this, so we can at least stay dry till we have to get wet?" Gorderon poked Fergan's shoulder with a thick finger. He was as wide as Fergan was skinny and a tyrant. Despite his grey eyes, horse handlers will put up the tent and steal everything in it that's loose. Fergan, another poke. "You want one of those light fingers walking off with my crossbow or my saddle?" "That's a good saddle," a third poke nearly pushed Fergan. "Over sideways we don't get this tent up, and Horn will have us standing guard all night." Fergan glowered and grumbled, but he picked up his hammer, wiping the mud off on his coat. He was a good enough soldier, but not very bright. Vanon spat through the gap in his teeth, just missing the kettle. The stew smelled wonderful after what Latel was making, but Mat decided he was not going to eat here either, tapping his wooden spoon in the rim of the kettle to clean it. The fat man looked up at Mat through heavy-lidded eyes. His round face often looked half asleep, but only a fool. "Believed it. At this rate we'll reach Lugard about the end of summer if we ever do." "We will, Vanon," Mat said more confidently than he felt. At the moment the rough woolen coat he had done dry a few hours ago only shed rain in spots, and water was trickling down his back. It was hard to feel confident with icy rain sliding down your backbone. "Winter's almost done. We'll move faster once the spring comes. You'll see come the middle of spring, and we'll be in Lugard." He was not so sure of that either. They covered no more than 2 leagues that first day, and after that 2.5. Made a good day. Not many places could be called towns along the Great North Road. A name that began to change very quickly as the show crept north. People called it the Abuar Road, or the Ferry Road, or sometimes just the road as if there were only one. But Lucas stopped at every last town, real or so-called walled or jumped-up village with 6 streets, and a rough-paved excuse for a town square near half a day went into just getting the show set up and the canvas wall erected around it, with that huge red-lettered blue banner hung across the entrance. Volin Luca's grand travelling show. It was just not in Luca to pass up the chance of a crowd, or the coins in their purses, or the chance to flourish one of his bright red cloaks and bask in their adulation. Luca liked that almost as much as the coin, almost. The strangers of the performers and the caged animals from far-off lands were sufficient to pull people the animals from. Not so far were enough for that matter. Few had been far enough into the countryside to see a bear, much less a lion. Only heavy rain lessened the crowd. And when the rain was too stiff, the jugglers and acrobats refused to perform anyway, without some sort of covering overhead, which made Lucas stalk about in a sullen snit and talk wildly of finding enough canvas tarps to shelter every act, or having a tent made large enough to hold the entire show one tent. The man was nothing if not grandiose in his ambitions. Why not a palace on wheels while he was about it? If Luca and the slow way the show moved had been all Mat had to worry about, though he would have been a happy man. Sometimes 2 or 3 slow-moving trains of Shashan settlers, who had gotten an early start, passed with their strangely shaped peaked wagons and odd-looking cattle or sheep or goats before the first wagon from the show began to move. Sometimes columns of Shashan soldiers overtook them as they ambled along at a slow walk, ranks of men wearing helmets like huge insects, heads stepping out smartly, and columns of horsemen with their armor of overlapping plates, painted in stripes, once the riders were untorn, bronze-caled, creatures like horse-sized cats, except for having 3 eyes anyway. 20 or so of them snaking along in a sinuous lope faster than a horse could trot. Neither the riders nor their mounts gave the show a second glance, but the show's horses went wild as the storm passed, screaming and rearing in the traces. The lions and leopards and bears roared in their cages, and the peculiar deer flung themselves against the bars trying to flee. It took hours to quiet everything down enough for the wagons to move again, and Luca insisted on having the caged Hanimal's scrape seen to first. His animals were a large investment twice. Officers in thin, plume-emmed helmets decided to check the warrant for Luca's horses, and Matt oozed cold sweat the size of grapes until they moved on again, satisfied as the show crept north. The numbers of Shaken on the road dwindled, yet he still sweated when he saw another party soldiers or settlers. Either one, maybe Soroth really was keeping Tuon's disappearance a secret, but the Sharkan would be searching for her. All it would take was one meddlesome officer who actually compared the numbers on the warrant with the number of horses. He would search the wagons with a fine-tooth comb after that. For certain, just one officious Suldam who thought there might be a woman who could channel among the jugglers and tumblers and contortionists. He sweated plums. Unfortunately, not everyone had a proper regard for their own skins outside a fly-speck village called Wissin, a thatch-roofed little cluster of houses where not even Luca thought 2 coppers could be shaken loose. Matt stood with a heavy woolen cloak pulled around him in a driving rain and watched the 3-eyed eyes steal back into the show. As the sunset thunder boomed in the distance, they were swathed in dark cloaks with the hoods well up. Yet he had no doubts who they were in the downpour they passed within 10 FT without seeing him. But the silver medallion hanging beneath his shirt went cold against his chest. At least one of them was channeling or holding the power anyway. Burn him, they were all 3 mad as loons. No sooner did the ice vanish among the wagons in tents than 3 more cloaked shapes appeared, hurrying after them. One of these women had a sharper eye, raising a hand to point at him, but the others only paused, and then they skewed after. The eyes together, he started to curse, then left it unuttered. He was beyond that. If he named the people he wanted, wandering around where a Shayan patrol might see them, the eyes had eye and the Sulam would come about, even with Tuon and Seleucia. I wonder what they want, Noel said behind him, and Matt gave a jump that let a torrent of rain into his cowl and down his neck. He wished the knobbly old man would quit sneaking up on him. I intend to find out, he muttered, jerking his cloak straight. He hardly knew why he bothered. His coat was only a little damp, but his linen shirt was already soaked oddly enough. Null was no longer with him when he reached the grey-streaked wagon, with its fading white wash, where the eyes and Suldam slept. The man liked sticking his nose in everywhere. Maybe he had decided he was wet enough, Blur, and Fen were already wrapped in their blankets beneath the wagon, apparently oblivious to rain or mud, but he would not have waged on either being asleep. Indeed, one sat up as he squelched up to the wagon. Whichever it was, he said nothing. Yet Matt could feel the man's eyes. He did not hesitate, though, and he did not bother with knocking. The interior was crowded with all 6 women on their feet, dripping cloaks still in hand. 2 lamps mounted in gimbals on the walls gave a good light, better than he could have wished for in a way. 6 faces swiveled toward him with those frozen looks women gave a man when he put a foot where they did not want it. The air in the wagon smelled of damp wool and felt as if lightning had just struck or might at any moment rain. Drummed down the roof and thunder rolled. But the fox-headed medallion felt no cooler than any other piece of silver. Maybe Blur and Fen had let him come inside thinking he would get his head snapped off. Maybe they just wanted to stay out of this themselves. But then a water was ready to die if his eyes decided it was necessary. Not Matt Cowan. He pushed the door shut with his hip. It hardly gave him a twinge anymore. Seldom anyway when he challenged the Medina, fiercely shaking out the black hair that spilled down her back. I am grateful to you for rescuing me from the Shachan Master Cathan, and I will show my gratitude, but there are limits. I am not your servant to be ordered about. There were no Shachan in the village, and we kept our faces hidden. There was no need to send your watchdogs after us. The look she shot at the 3 Seanchan women could have fried eggs. Edina was being over-nervous about anyone with a Seanchan accent. She wanted some of her own back, and the Sul'dam were close to hand. Matt was counting on that fabled Aes Sedai self-control to keep matters short of violence. He hoped it was not already stretched too far to hold. Those old memories were called eye-going up like illuminators' wares. Bethamin's dark face showed no sign of alarm. She had finished shaking out her cloak and hanging it on a peg while Edina was speaking, then smoothed her dress over her hips. Tonight she wore faded green petticoats. She complained that the Abu Dari garment was indecent, and he supposed that he would have to find her something else. Now they were away from the coast, but she did fill out that very low neckline. Nicely, she sounded too much like a mother for his taste, though they did keep their faces hidden. "My lord," she drawled, and they stayed together. No one tried to sneak off, very well behaved all in all. Her mother praising her children, or maybe a dog trainer praising the dogs. Yellow-haired Cedar nodded approvingly. "Definitely a dog trainer, if my lord wishes to keep them confined," Rena said flesomly. "We can always use the Edam. They really shouldn't be trusted loose." She even offered him a bow in the Seanchan way, bending herself at a sharp right angle. Her big brown eyes looked hopeful. Teslan gasped and clutched her wet cloak to her bosom. She certainly was not over her fear of the Sul'dam, for all she looked as though she could eat nails. Jolene, haughty as ever, drew herself up, eyes flashing. I said I Serena's well strike when Jolene's eyes started flashing. It was often so with pretty women, no, Matt said hastily. There's no need for that. You give those things to me, and I'll get rid of them light. Why had he ever saddled himself with these women? What seemed the best idea at the time could look pure quill. Stupid in hindsight. All of you just have to be careful. We're not 30 mi from Abu Dar, yet the roads are full of bloody Seanchan. He gave an apologetic look to the 3 Seanchan women. They were on his side after all. In a matter of speaking, they had nowhere else to go except to Genan, and they had realized who had the money. Bethamin's eyebrows twitched upward in surprise. Shonachen nobles did not apologize even with a glance. Seanchan soldiers did pass through the village yesterday, Teslan said. Her Ileana accent particularly strong. Jolene's flashing eyes shifted to her, but she took no notice beyond turning away to hang up her own cloak. They did ask questions about strangers on the road, and some did complain about being sent north. Teslan glanced over her shoulder at the Sul'dam, then jerked her eyes away and took a deep breath. It does seem the return be aimed east. The soldiers did believe the ever-victorious army will present Elayne to their empress before the end of spring, the city itself and all the rest. Supposedly Aes Sedai gave up the lands of their birth when they went to the White Tower, but to any Illaner, the city of Elayne was the city capital City, and you could hear the capital. That's good, Matt said half to himself, thinking soldiers talked out of turn all. The time that was one reason you did not tell your plans to every trooper until the last minute. Teslan's thin eyebrows rose and he added, It means the road to Lugard will be clear most of the way. Teslan's nod was curt and not very pleased what I said I was supposed to do, and what they did were often widely different. We didn't speak to anyone. My lord only watched the girls, Bethamin said, even more slowly than usual, and Seanchan usually talked like honey pouring in a snowstorm. She was clearly in charge among the 3 Sul'dam, but she looked at each of the others before going on in Ebwa. All the talk in the Sul'dam quarters was of Elayne, a fat land and a fat city, where many would earn new names and wealth. She tossed that in, as if wealth hardly counted alongside a new name. We should have realized you would want to know about such things. Another deep breath almost popped her out of that dress. If you have any questions, my lord, we'll tell you what we know. Rena made him another bow, her face eager, and Cedar piped up with, We could listen in the towns and villages where we stopped too, my lord. The girls can be shifty, but you can trust us. Why, when a woman offered to help you, did she always start by sticking you in a pot of hot water and stoking up the fire? Jolene's face became a disdainful mask of ice. The Seanchan women were beneath her notice, she made that clear. With a glance, it was Matt Bloody Coffin who received her freezing gaze. Edina's mouth thinned and she tried to stare holes in him, and the Sul'dam, both even Teslan, managed indignation. She was grateful for rescue too, but she was Aes Sedai, and she directed her frown at him. He suspected she would jump like a startled frog if one of the Suldam clapped her hands. "What I want," he explained patiently, "is for all of you to stay with the wagons. You had to be patient with women, including Aes Sedai." He was bloody well learning that by heart. One whisper, "There's an eyes with this show, and we'll be hip-deep in Seanchan, hunting for her rumors of Seanchan with the show won't serve us any better. Either way, somebody will come to find out what's behind it sooner or later, and we'll all be in the pickling kettle. Don't flaunt yourselves. You need to stay low till we get closer to Lugard. That isn't so much to ask now, is it?" Lightning lit up the wagon's windows with a blue flash, and thunder crashed overhead so close it rattled the wagon. It was too much to ask, apparently, as the days wore on. Oh, the eyes kept their hoods well up when they went outside. The rain gave enough excuse for that. The rain and the cold. But one or another rode on the wagon seat as often as not, and they made no real effort to pass as servants around the show. Not that they admitted who they were, of course, or ordered anyone about, or even spoke to anyone much besides each other. But what servant clearly expected people to move? Out of her way, they went into the villages too, and sometimes the towns, as if they were sure there were no Seanchan there. When Antui was sure of something, it had to be true. Twice, they came scurrying back when they found a town half full of settlers on their way north. They told him what they learned on their visits. He thought they did. Teslan did seem grateful after an Aes Sedai fashion and after a fashion. Despite their differences, Jolene, Teslan, and Edina stuck together like herded geese. If you saw one, you saw all three, likely. That was because when you saw them taking a stroll, all neatly cloaked, and hidden as they were a minute later, Bethaman and Rena and Cedar appeared trailing after them. Oh, so casually, but never letting the girls out of sight. The goose herds a blind man could see. There was tension between the two groups of women. A blind man could see none of them were servants. The Suldam had held respected positions of authority, and they moved almost as arrogantly as the Aes Sedai. He was stuck with the story. Though Bethaman and the other two were as leery of other Seanchan as the Aes Sedai were, yet they also followed. The Aes Sedai when they went into a village or town, and Bethaman always reported the tidbits they had picked up by eavesdropping with Rena, wearing an ingratiating smile, and Cedar chirping in that the girls had missed this or that, or claimed not to have heard. You could never be sure with someone who had the audacity to call herself Eyes. Maybe he should reconsider having them leashed, just till everything was safe. Their tales really were not that different from what the sisters told him townsfolk's talk of what they had overheard from Shahan passing through. Many of the settlers were nervous, their heads full of tales about savage Aiel ravaging through Alara. Though the local people all said that was up north somewhere, it seemed someone higher might be thinking the same, though because many settlers had been diverted east toward Elon. An alliance had been concluded with someone powerful, who was expected to give the High Lady Surath access to many lands. The women refused to be convinced that they need not listen for rumors. They never quite got around to handing over the Edom. Either in truth those silvery leashes and the three Suldam were the only real lever he had with the Aes Sedai gratitude from an Aedai, and not that he really thought about putting those collars on the sisters again. Not often, anyway. He was well and truly stuck. He truly did have no need of what the Sulam and I said. I learned he had better sources, people he trusted well. He trusted Tom when the white-haired Gleman could be routed out from playing snakes and foxes with Oliver, or mooning over a much-creased letter he carried tucked in the breast of his coat. Tom could walk into a common room, tell a story, maybe juggle a bit and walk out, knowing what was in the head of every man. There Matt trusted Julian too. He did almost as well as Tom without juggling her storytelling, but Julian always insisted on taking the with him, demurely clutching his arm as they strolled into a town to get her used to freedom again. The man said. She smiled up at Julian, those big eyes shining darkly, that full little mouth asking to be kissed. Maybe she had been Panarch of Terrebon, the way Julian and Tom claimed, but Matt was beginning to doubt it. He had heard some of the contortionists joking about how the Terrebon or serving girl was wearing the tyrant thief-catcher out till he could barely walk Panarch or serving girl, though the still started to kneel any time she heard a drawing accent. Matt figured that any Seanchan who asked her a question would get everything she knew, beginning with Julian Sandar and ending with which wagon the Aes Sedai were in, all answers delivered from her knees. There was a bigger danger than I said, and Stam put together in his book Julian bridled at. The slightest suggestion his woman might be unreliable, though, and spun his bamboo staff as if he was considering cracking Matt's head for him. There was no solution, but Matt found a stopgap, a way to get a little warning if the worst occurred. "Of course I can follow them," Noel said with a gap-toothed grin that said it would be child's play, laying a gnarled finger alongside his bent nose. He slipped the other knobbly hand beneath his coat, where he kept his knives. "Are you sure it wouldn't be better just to make sure she can't talk to anyone?" "Just a suggestion, lad. If you say not, then not." Matt most emphatically said not. He had killed one woman in his life and left another to be butchered. He was not going to add a third to his soul. "It seems Sir might have made an alliance with some king," Julian reported with a smile over a cup of mulled wine. At least there seemed to be making him smile more. She huddled beside Julian's stool in their cramped tent, her head lying on his lap, and he stroked her hair softly with his free hand. "At least there's considerable talk of some powerful new ally, and those settlers are all frightened out of their wits by Aiel. Most of the settlers seem to have been sent east," Tom said, peering sadly into his cup as Julian grew happier. Day by day, he seemed to grow sadder. Null was outshadowing Julian and Thera, and Lenin and Naram were sitting cross-legged at the back of the tent. But the two Karen and serving men had their mending baskets out and were examining Matt's good coats from Abu Dar for any repairs they thought necessary, so the small tent still seemed crowded. "And a great many soldiers, too," Tom went on. "Everything says they're going to fall on Ilion like a hammer." Well, at least he knew he was hearing the unvarnished truth when he heard it from them. No eyes had eye-spinning words in their heads, or Suldam trying to ascend their way into his good graces. Bethaman and Cedar had even learned to curtsy. Somehow he felt more comfortable with Rena bending herself double. It seemed honest, strange, but honest for himself, town or village. Matt took no more than a quick look around with his collar turned up and his cap pulled down before heading back to the show. He seldom wore a cloak. A cloak could make it difficult to use the knives he carried tucked about his person. Not that he expected to need them, it was just a prudent precaution. There was no drinking, no dancing, and no gambling, especially no gambling. The sound of dice rattling on a table in an inn's common room pulled at him. But his sort of luck with dice was bound to be remarked, even if it did not lead to somebody pulling a knife. And in this part of Alara, both men and women carried knives tucked behind their belts and were ready to use them. He wanted to pass through unnoticed, so he walked by the dice games, nodded coolly to the tavern maids who smiled at him, and never drank more than a cup of wine. And usually not that. After all, he had work to do back at the show, work of a sort. He had begun it the very first night after leaving Abu Budar, and a rough job. It was, "I need you to go with me," he had said. Then, pulling open the cupboard, built into the side of the wagon beneath his bed, he kept his chest of gold in there. All honestly come by through gambling as honestly as he could anyway. The greater part came from one horse race, and his luck was no better than any other man's with horses for the rest. If a man wanted to toss dice or play at cards or pitch coins, he had to be ready to lose. Dolman, seated on the other bed, rubbing a hand over the bristle on his shaved scalp, had learned that lesson. The fellow should have been willing to sleep on the floor like a good Sojan. But in the beginning, he had insisted on flipping a coin with Matt each night for the second bed Anan. Got the first, of course. Tossing coins was as easy as dice, as long as the coin did not land on edge the way it sometimes did for him. But Dolman had made the offer, not him, until Matt had won 4 times straight, and then the 5th night the coin did land on edge 3 times in a row. They took turn and turn about now, but it was still Dolman's turn for the floor tonight, binding the smallish wash-leather bag he was after. He stuffed it into his coat pocket and straightened, pushing the cupboard shut with his foot. "You have to face her sometime," he said, "and I need you to smooth things over." Needed someone to attract Tuon's eye, someone to make him seem acceptable by comparison. But he could not say that, could he? "You're a Seanchan noble, and you can keep me from putting my boot in my mouth. Why do you need to smooth things over?" Ainan's stroll was hard as a saw. She stood against the wagon's door with her fists on her hips, blue eyes auguring out from beneath her long black wig. "Why do you need to see her? Haven't you done enough? Don't tell me you're afraid of her." Matt scoffed, dodging the question. What answer could he give that did not sound insane? "You could tuck her under your arm almost as easily as I could, but I promise not to let her cut your head off or beat you up again. Do not be afraid of anything." Boy Dolman growled protectively. "If she does not want to go, Then you trot off to court the girl by yourself, stay the night if you choose. Einan continued to glare at Mat or through him. Then she glanced at Dolman. Her shoulders slumped a little, and she snatched her cloak from its peg on the wall. "Get a move on Karen," she growled. "If it has to be done best, it's done, and over with." She was out of the wagon in a flash, and Mat had to hurry to catch her up. You could almost think she did not want to be alone with Dolman, as little sense as that made outside the windowless purple wagon. Black in the night, a shadow shifted in the deeper shadows. The sickle moon came out from behind the clouds long enough for Mat to recognize Harnon's lantern jaw. "Oh, quiet, my lord," the file leader said. Mat nodded and took a deep breath. Feeling for the wash-leather bag in his pocket, the air was clean washed by the rain and away from the horse lines. Tuon must be relieved to be away from the dung smell and the rank odor of the animal cages. The performers' wagons to his left were as dark as the canvas-topped storage wagons to his right. No use waiting any longer. He pushed again up the purple wagon steps ahead of him. There were more people inside than he expected. Satala was seated on one of the beds working her embroidery hoop again, and Susia stood at the far end, scowling beneath her headscarf. But Null was sitting on the other bed, apparently lost in thought, and Tuon sat cross-legged on the floor playing snakes and foxes with Oliver. The boy twisted around with a wide-mouthed grin that almost split his face when Mat came in. "Na has been telling us about Codens and Mat," he exclaimed. "That's another name for Shara. Did you know the Ayad tattoo their faces? That's what they call women who can channel in Shara." "No, I didn't," Mat said, settling a grim eye on Noel. It was bad enough that Vannon and the Red Arms were teaching the boy bad habits, not to mention what he was picking up from Julian and Tom, without Null filling his head with made-up nonsense. Suddenly Null slapped his thigh and sat up straight. "I remember now," he said, and then the fool began to recite fortune rides like the sun on high with the fox that makes the ravens fly, luck his soul, the lightning his eye. He snatches the moons from out of the sky. The broken-nosed old man looked around as if just realizing anyone else was there. "I've been trying to remember that it's from the prophecies of the dragon. Very interesting, no?" Mat muttered. Those colors whirled in his head, just the way they had that morning when the ice and I were panicking. They flashed away without making a picture this time, but he felt as cold as if he had spent a night sleeping under a bush in his skin. The last thing on earth he needed was anybody else linking him to the prophecies. "Maybe sometime you can recite the whole thing for us, but not tonight, eh?" Tuon looked up at him through her eyelashes, a black porcelain doll in a dress that was too big for her light, but she had long lashes. She ignored Einan, as if the other woman did not exist, and in truth, Aginan was doing her best to appear part of a cabinet built into the wall. "So much for hoping for a diversion. Toy doesn't mean to be rude," Tuon murmured in that slow, honey drawl. "He just has never been trained in manners. But it is late Master Charin time for Oliver to be in bed. Perhaps you will escort him to his tent. We'll play again another time. Oliver, would you like me to teach you to play stones?" Oliver most emphatically would. He almost wriggled saying so. The boy liked anything that gave him a chance to smile at a woman, not to mention a chance to say things that should have gotten him slapped, till his ears swelled up bigger than they already were, if Mat ever found out which of his uncles was teaching him that. But the lad gathered the pieces of his game and carefully rolled up the line-marked cloth without a second urging. He even made a very good leg, thanking the High Lady before letting Null lead him from the wagon. Mat nodded approvingly. He had taught the boy how to make a leg, but the boy usually added a leer for a pretty woman if he ever found out who you have a reason for interrupting me, Toydan said in cool tones. "It is late and I was thinking of going to sleep." He made a leg and gave her his best smile. He could be polite even if she was not. "I just wanted to make sure you were all right. These wagons are uncomfortable on the road, and I know you weren't happy with the clothes I could find you. I thought this might make you feel a little better." Fishing the leather bag from his pocket, he presented it with a flourish. Women always like that little extra flourish. Susia tensed, blue eyes sharpening, but Tuon waggled her slim fingers, and the bosom maid subsided a little. Mat liked feisty women by and large, but if she ruined this, he was going to paddle her bottom. He hung on to his smile with an effort, and even managed to ratchet it up a notch. Tuon turned the bag over her hands several times before untying the drawstrings and spilling what it contained into her lap, a heavy necklace of gold and carved amber. An expensive piece, and Seanchan worked to boot. He was proud of finding the thing. It had been the property of an acrobat, who had it from a Seanchan officer whose fancy she caught, but she had been willing to sell now that her officer was left behind. It did not suit her skin, whatever that meant. He smiled and waited. Jewels always softened a woman's heart. No one's reaction was quite what he expected. Though Tuon lifted the necklace in front of her face with both hands studying it, as if she had never seen such a thing before. Saluka's lip curled in a sneer. Satala set her embroidery down on her knees and looked at him, the large golden hoops in her ears swaying, as she shook her head abruptly. Tuon thrust the necklace back over her shoulder towards Sucia. "It does not suit me," she said. "Would you like it, Sucia?" Mat's smile slipped a little. The cream-skinned woman took the necklace between thumb and forefinger as if holding a dead rat by the tail, a piece for a shade dancer to wear with her veil. She said, "Riley." With a twist of her wrist, she hurled the necklace at Elayne, snapping, "Put it on." Elayne caught the thing just before it hit her face. Mat's smile slid the rest of the way off his. He expected an explosion, but Egwene immediately fumbled open the clasp and pushed her heavy wig back to fasten it behind her neck. Her face might have been molded from snow for all the expression on it turned Sucia commanded, and it was a command without any doubt. "Let me see." Elayne turned stiff as a fence post, but she turned. Satella looked at her intently with a puzzled shake of her head, then gave Mat a different head shake before returning to her embroidery. Women had as many ways of shaking their heads as they had looks. This one, said he, was a fool. And if he did not catch the finer nuances, he was just as glad he did not think he would have liked them. Burn him, he bought a necklace for Tuon, who gave it to Sucia right in front of him. And now it was Elayne's. She came for a new name. Tuon said musingly. "What does she call herself?" Liwin Selucia replied, a fitting name for a shade dancer. "Liwin Shipless, perhaps." Tuon nodded. Liwin Shipless again, jerked as though every word was a slap. "May I withdraw?" she asked stiffly, bending in sharp bow. "If you want to go, then go," Mat growled, bringing her in the first place and up in the best notion he ever had. But maybe he could recover a little without her eyes locked on the floorboards again, sank to her knees. "Please, may I withdraw?" Tuon sat there straight back on the floor, staring through the taller woman, clearly not seeing her at all. Sucia eyed again up and down, pursing her lips. Satala pushed her needle through the cloth stretched on her hoop. No one so much as glanced at Mat. Arnon dropped to her face and Mat bit back a startled oath when she kissed the floor. "Please," she said harassingly, "I beg leave to withdraw." "You will go," Liwin Sucia said, cold as a queen speaking to a chicken thief, "and you will not let me see your face again unless it is covered by a shade dancer's veil." Elayne scrambled backward on hands and knees and all but tumbled out the door so fast that Mat was left gaping with an effort. He managed to regain his smile. There seemed little point in staying, but a man could make a graceful exit. "Well, I suppose?" Tuon wriggled her fingers again, still not looking at him, and Selucia cut him short. "The High Lady is weary, Toy. You have her permission to go." "Look, my name is Mat," he said. "An easy name, a simple name, Mat." Tuon might as well have been a porcelain doll in truth for all the response she made. Satala set down her embroidery, though, and rose with one hand resting lightly on the hilt of the curved dagger stuck behind her belt. "Young man, if you think you're going to lounge about till you get to see us readying for bed, you're sadly mistaken." She smiled saying it, but she did have her hand on her knife, and she was Abu Dari enough to stick a man on a whim. Tuon remained an unmoving doll, a queen. On her throne, somehow mistakenly dressed in ill-fitting clothes, Mat Leftane was leaning on one hand against the side of the wagon. Her head hanging, her other hand was gripping the necklace around her throat. Arnon moved a little way off in the darkness, just to show he was still there, a wise man to keep clear of Elayne just then. Mat was too irritated for wisdom. "What was that about?" he demanded. "You don't have to go on your knees to Tuon anymore. And Selucia, she's a bloody lady's maid. I don't know anybody who jumped for his queen the way you jumped for her." Elayne's hard face was shadowed, but her voice was haggarded. "The High Lady is who she is. Sucia is her sojourn. No one to the low blood would dare meet her sojourn's eyes, and maybe not the high blood either. The clasp broke with a metallic snap as she jerked the necklace free. But then I'm not of any blood now, rearing back. She put her whole body into throwing the necklace as far into the night as she could. Matt opened his mouth. He could have bought a dozen prime horses with what he paid for that thing, and had coin left. He closed it again. Without saying a word, he might not always be wise, but he was wise enough to know when a woman really might try to stick a knife in him. He knew another thing as well. If Aenan behaved this way around Tuon and Seleucia, then he had better make sure the Sul'dam were kept clear. The light only knew what they would do if Tuon started wiggling her fingers. That left him with a job of work to do. Well, he hated work, but those old memories had his head stuffed full of battles. He hated battle too. A man could get killed dead, but it was better than work, strategy and tactics. Learn the ground, learn your enemy, and if you could not win one way, you found another. The next night he returned to the purple wagon alone, and once Oliver had finished his lesson in stones from Tuon, Matt inveighed his way into a game, at first sitting on the floor across the board from the dark little woman. He was not sure whether to win or lose. Some women like to win every time, but the man had to make her work for it. Some like the man to win, or at least more often than he lost. Neither made any sense to him. He liked to win, and the easier the better, but that was how it was while he was dithering. Tuon took matters out of his hands halfway through the game. He realized she had him in a trap. He could not get out of her. White stones were cutting off his black everywhere. It was a clean and resounding win for her. "You don't play very well, Toy," she said mockingly. Despite the tone, her big liquid eyes considered him coolly. Weighing and measuring a man could drown in eyes like that. He smiled and made his goodbyes before there could be any thought of kicking him out strategy. Think to the future, do the unexpected. The next night he brought a small red paper flower made by one of the show's seamstresses and presented it to a startled Seleucia. Satala's eyebrows rose, and even Tuon seemed taken. A back tactics put your opponent off balance. Come to think, women in battles were not that different. Both wrapped a man in fog and could kill him without trying if he was careless every night. He visited the purple wagon for a game of stones under Satala and Seleucia's watchful eyes, and he concentrated on the cross-hatched board. Tuon was very good, and it was all too easy to find himself watching the way she placed her stones with her fingers bent back in a curiously graceful way. She was used to having fingernails an inch long and taking care not to break them. Her eyes were a danger too. You needed a clear head in stones or battle, and her gaze seemed to reach inside his skull. He buckled down to the game, though, and managed to win 4 of the next 7, with 1 draw. Tuon was satisfied when she won, and determined when she lost. With none of the temper tantrums he had feared, no scathing comments aside from insisting on calling him Toy Not. Very much of that icy, regal hot, as long as they were playing anyway. She purely enjoyed the game, laughing exultantly when she pulled him into a trap, laughing in delight when he managed a clever placement to escape. She seemed a different woman once she lost herself in the stones board. A flower sewn from blue linen followed the paper blossom, and 2 days later, a pink silk bloom that spread out as wide as a woman's palm. Both handed to her blue eyes, increasingly set in a suspicious frown when they rested on him, but Tuon told her she could keep the flowers, and she stored them away. Carefully folded in a linen cloth, he let 3 days pass without a present, then brought a little cluster of red silk rosebuds, complete with short stems and glistening leaves that looked as real as nature, only more perfect. He had asked the seamstress to make it on the day he bought that first paper flower. Sucia took a step, reaching to accept the rosebuds with a curl to her lip, but he sat down and put the flowers beside the board a little toward Tuon. He said nothing, just left it lying there. She never so much as glanced at it, dipping into the small leather bags that held the stones. He plucked 1 from each and shuffled them between his hands, till even he was unsure which was where, then offered his closed fists. Tuon hesitated a moment, studying his face with no expression, then tapped his left hand. He opened it to display the glistening white stone. "I've changed my mind, Toy," she murmured, placing the white stone carefully on the intersection of 2 lines near the center of the board. "You play very well." Matt blinked. Could she know what he was up to? Seleucia was standing at Tuon's back, seemingly absorbed in the almost empty board. Satala turned a page in her book and shifted a little to get a better light. Of course not. She was talking about stones. If she even suspected his real game, she would toss him out on his ear. Any woman would. It had to be the stones. That was the night they played to a draw with each of them, controlling half the board in irregular pools and patches. In truth, she won a victory. "I have kept my word, Toy," she drawled, as he was replacing the stones in the bags. "No attempts to escape. No attempts at betrayal. This is confining." She gestured around at the interior of the wagon. "I wish to take walks after dark will do. You may accompany me." Her eyes touched the cluster of rosebuds, then rose to his face to make sure I don't run away. Satala marked her place with a slim finger and looked at him. Seleucia stood behind Tuon and looked at him. The woman had kept her word. Mad as that seemed, walks after dark with most of the showfolk already in their beds would do no harm, not with him there to make sure. So why did he feel that he was losing control of the situation? Tuon agreed to go cloaked and hooded, which was something of a relief. The black hair was growing back in on her shaved scalp, but so far it was little more than long fuzz, and unlike Susia, who very likely slept in her headscarf, Tuon had shown no inclination to cover her head. A child-sized woman with hair shorter than any man not going bald would have been remarked even in the night. Satala and Seleucia always followed at a little distance in the darkness. The ladies made maid to keep a protective eye on her mistress, and Satala to keep an eye on the maid, at least he thought. That was how it was. Sometimes it seemed they were both watching him. The two of them were awfully friendly for guard and prisoner. He had overheard Satala cautioning Seleucia that he was a rogue with women, a fine thing for her to be saying, and Seleucia had calmly replied that her lady would break his arms if he showed any disrespect, just as if they were not prisoners at all. He thought to use these walks to learn a little more about Tuon. She did not talk much over a stones board, but she had a way of ignoring what he asked or deflecting the subject usually to him. "The Two Rivers is all forests and farms," he said as they strolled along the main street of the show. Clouds hid the moon, and the colourful wagons were indistinguishable dark shapes. The performers' platforms lining the street merely shadows. "Everybody grows toberk and races sheep. My father breeds cows too and trades horses, but mostly it's toberk and sheep from one end to the other. Your father trades horses to unmurred. And what do you do?" "Toy." He glanced over his shoulder at the two women ghosting along 10 paces back. Satala might not be close enough to hear if he kept his voice down, but he decided to be honest. Besides, the show was dead quiet in the darkness. She might hear, and she knew what he had been doing in Abu Dar. "I'm a gambler," he said. "My father called himself a gambler," Tuon said softly. "He died of a bad wager, and how were you supposed to find out what that meant?" Another night walking along a row of animal cages, each one built to fill an entire wagon. He said, "What do you do for fun, Tuon, just because you enjoy it aside?" "From playing stones." He could almost feel bristling at his use of her name from 30 Eft away, but Tuon did not seem to mind. He thought she did not. "I train horses and demon," she said, peering into a cage that held a sleeping lion. The animal was only a large shadow lying on the straw behind the thick bars. "Does he really have a black man? There are no lions with black manes in all of Shanjan." She trained Demani for fun light horses. What kind of horses it might be. War horses if she trained bloody Demani for fun. "Mistress Annan tells me you're a scoundrel, Toy." Her voice was cool, not cold. Composed, she turned toward him, face hidden in the shadows of her cowl. "How many women have you kissed?" The lion woke up and coughed a deep sound, guaranteed to raise the hair on anyone's head. Chon did not even flinch. "Looks like rain's coming again," he said weakly. "Salish will have my hide if I get you back soaked." He heard her laugh softly. What did he said? That was funny. There was a price to pay. Of course, maybe things were going his way and maybe not. But when you thought they were, there was always a price bunch of chattering. Magpies, he complained to Anan the afternoon, sat on the horizon, a red-gold ball half hidden by clouds casting the show in long shadows. There was no rain for once, and in spite of the cold, they were sitting hunched beneath the green wagon they shared, playing stones in plain sight of anyone who walked by, a good many. Did men hurrying about some last-minute chore, children snatching the final chance to roll hoops through the mud puddles and toss balls before night fell. Women holding their skirts up glanced at the wagon in passing, and even when they were hooded, Matt knew what their expressions were. Hardly a woman in the show would speak to Matt Coffin irritably. He rattled the black stones he held gathered in his left hand. They'll get their gold when we reach Lugard. That's all they ought to care about. They shouldn't be poking their noses into my business. You can hardly blame them, Aginan drawled. Studying the board, you and I are supposed to be fleeing lovers, but you spend more time with her than with me. She still had trouble not calling to, on high lady, you behave like a man courting. She reached to place her stone, then stopped with her hand above the board. You can't think she'll complete the ceremony, can you? You can't be that big a fool. What ceremony? What are you talking about? You named her your wife 3 times that night in Abois. She said slowly, You really don't know a woman says 3 times that a man is her husband, and he says 3 times she's his wife, and they're married there. Are blessings involved usually? But it's saying it in front of witnesses that makes it a marriage you really didn't know. Matt laughed and shrugged his shoulders, feeling the knife hanging behind his neck. A good knife gave a man a feeling of comfort, but his laugh was horsaro, but she didn't say anything. He had bloody well been stuffing a gag in her mouth at the time, so whatever I said, it doesn't mean anything. But he knew what was going to say. Sure, his water was wet. He knew he had been told who he was going to marry with the blood. It's a little different. Sometimes a noble from one end of the empire marries a noble from the other, an arranged marriage. The imperial family never has any other kind. They may not want to wait until they can be together, so one acknowledges the marriage where she is, and the other where he is. As long as they both speak in front of witnesses inside a year and a day. The marriage is legal. You truly didn't know sure was sure, but the stones still spilled from his hand onto the board, bouncing everywhere. The bloody girl knew. Maybe she thought this whole thing was an adventure or a game. Maybe she thought being kidnapped was as much fun as training horses or bloody demon. But he knew he was a trout waiting for her to set the hook. He stayed away from the purple wagon for 2 days. There was no use running. He already had the bloody hook in his mouth, and he had put it there himself. But he did not have to swallow the flaming thing. Only he knew it was just a matter of when she decided to jerk the line tight as slowly as the show moved. Eventually, they reached the ferry across the Eleldar running from Alandar on the west bank to Karaman, on the east tidy little walled towns of tile-roof stone buildings with 6 stone docks. Each the sun was climbing high, hardly a cloud crossed the sky, and those wide as new washed wool. No rain today. Maybe it was an important crossing with trading ships from upriver, tied to some of the docks and big bargel-like ferries crawling from one town to the other. On long sweeps, the Seanchan apparently thought so too. They had military camps outside both towns, and from the stone walls beginning to rise around the camps, and the stone structures going up inside. They had no intention of leaving soon. Matt crossed over with the first wagons riding pips. The brown geeling looked ordinary enough to an undiscerning eye. It did not seem out of place for him to be ridden by a fellow in a rough woolen coat with a woolen cap pulled down over his ears against the cold. He was not actually considering making a run for the hilly wooded ridge country behind Corman, thinking about it, but not really considering she was going to set the hook whether he ran or not. So he sat pips at the end of one of the stone ferry landings, watching the show cross, over and trundle away through the town. There were Seanchan in the landings, a squad of beefy men in segmented armor painted blue and burnt gold under a lean young officer, with one thin blue plume on his odd-looking helmet. They seemed to be there just to keep order, but the officer checked Luca's horse warrant, and Luca inquired whether the noble lord might know of ground outside the town, suitable for his show to perform. Matt could have wept. He could see soldiers wearing striped armor in the street behind him, wandering in and out of shops and taverns, a rocken swooped down out of the sky on long-ribbed wings lighting outside one of the camps across the river. 3 or 4 of the snake-necked creatures were already on the ground. There had to be hundreds of soldiers in those camps, maybe 1,000, and Luca was going to put on his show. Then one of the ferries hit the rope-padded bumpers at the end of the landing, and the ramp came down to let the windowless purple wagon rumble off onto the stones. Satala was driving. Seleucia sat on one side of her, peering out from the hood of a faded red cloak. On the other side, swathed in a dark cloak, so not an inch of her showed, was too. Matt thought his eyes were going to fall out of his head, if his heart did not pound its way out of his chest. First the dice had started up in his head, that rattling feel of dice rolling across a table. They were going to come up the Dark One's eyes this time. He just knew it. There was nothing to do except fall in beside the purple wagon, though riding along as though life were wonderful. riding along the wide main street through criers for shops and hawkers selling things from trays and Shakan soldiers. They were not marching in formation now, and they eyed the brightly painted wagons with interest, riding along and waiting for Tuon to shout. She had given her word, but a prisoner would say anything to get the shackles loosened. All she had to do was raise her voice and summon 1,000 Seanchan soldiers for rescue. The dice bounced and spun in Mat's head, riding along, waiting for the Dark One's eyes. Tuon never spoke a word. She peeked curiously past the edge of her deep cowl, curiously and cautiously, but she kept her face hidden and even her hands all wrapped in that dark cloak, and even huddling against Satala like a child seeking the protection of her mother. In a strange crowd, never a word until they had passed the gates of Corman and were rumbling toward the base of the ridge that rose behind the town, where Luca was already gathering the show's wagons. That was when Mat really knew there was no escape for him. She was going to set the hook all right. She was just biding her bloody time. He made sure all the Seanchan stayed in their wagons that night, and the Aes Sedai too. Nobody had seen any Soldum or Timati that Mat knew, but the Aes did not argue. For once, Tuon did not argue either. She made a demand that sent Satala's eyebrows almost to her hairline. It was phrased as a request, in a way a reminder of a promise he had made, but he knew a demand when a woman made one. Well, the man had to trust the woman he was going to marry. He told her he had to think on it, just so she would not start imagining she could have anything she wanted out of him. He thought on it all the day that Luca put on his show, thinking and sweating, while as many Seanchan as not came to gape at the performers. He thought on it, while the wagons wound eastward through the hills, moving slower than ever. But he knew what answer he had to give on the third day. After leaving the river, they reached the salt town of Juridor, and he told Tuon that he would. She smiled at him, and the dice in his head stopped dead. He would always remember that she smiled, and then the dice stopped. A man could weep. Chapter 29. Something flickers, this to be madness. Dolman rumbled from where he stood with his arms folded as if blocking the way out of the wagon. Maybe his jaw was thrust forward, belligerently sticking out a beard that was trimmed short, but still longer than the hair on his head. And he was working his hands like a man thinking of making fists or grappling with something. A wide man, Dolman, and not as fat as he looked on first glance. Mat wanted to avoid fists or grappling. If he could, he finished tying the black silk scarf around his neck, hiding his scar, and tucked the long ends into his coat. The chance that there was anyone in Juridor who knew about a man in Abu Dar wearing a black scarf? Well, the odds seemed good. Even discounting his luck, of course, there was always his being to be factored in. But if that was going to bring him face to face with Suro or fistful of servants from the Terrace Palace, he could stay in bed with a blanket wrapped around his head, and it still would happen. Sometimes you just had to trust to luck. The trouble was, when he woke this morning, the dice had again been tumbling in his head. They were bouncing off the inside of his skull. Still, I promised. He said it was good to be back in decent clothes. The coat was a fine green wool, well cut and hanging almost to his knees, and the turned-down tops of his boots. There was no embroidery. Maybe it could do with a little, but he had a touch of lace at his cuffs and a good silk shirt. He wished he had a mirror. A man needed to look his best on a day like this. Picking up his cloak from the bed, he swung it across his shoulders, not a gaudy thing like Lucas, dark grey, nearly as dark as night. Only the lining was red. His cloak pin was simple silver knots, no larger than his thumbs. She gave her word. Elayne said her word. She will not break that ever again, and sounded absolutely convinced. More convinced than Mat was, anyway. But sometimes a man had to take a chance, even if he was wagering his neck he had promised, and he did have his luck. It'd still be madness. Dolman grumbled, but he moved grudgingly away from the door when Mat settled his broad-brimmed black hat on his head. Well, when Niganan motioned him aside with a quick jerk of her head. Anyway, he kept his glower, though she followed Mat out of the wagon, scowling herself and fiddling with her long black wig. Maybe she still felt uneasy with it, or maybe it fit differently now that she had close to a month's growth of her own hair underneath. Not enough to go about bareheaded, yet in any case, not till there was at least another 100 miles between them and Abu Budar. Maybe it would not be safe until they crossed the Diona Mountains into Mirandi. The sky was clear, the sun just cresting the horizon, invisible, yet behind the show's canvas wall, and the morning was warm, only compared to a snowstorm. Not the crispness of a late winter morning in the two rivers, but a chill that slowly bored deep and put a faint mist. In your breath, the showfolk were scurrying about like ants in a kicked anthill, filling the air with shouted demands to know who had moved those juggling rings, or borrowed that pair of red-spangled breeches, or shifted this performing platform. It looked and sounded like the start of a riot, yet there was no real anger in any of the voices. They shouted and waved arms all the time, but it never came to blows when there was a show in the offing, and somehow every performer would be in place and ready before the first patrons were let in. They might be slow packing, up for the road, but performing meant money and they could move fast enough for that. "You really do think you can marry her?" Einan muttered, striding along at his side, kicking her worn brown woolen skirts. There was nothing dainty about Aginan. She had a long stride and she kept up easily. Dress or no dress, she seemed to need a sword on her hip. There's no other explanation for this. Bail is right. You are mad. Matt grinned. The question is, does she mean to marry me? The strangest people marry sometimes when you knew you were going to hang. The only thing to do was grin at the news, so he grinned and left her standing there. With a scowl on her hard face, he thought she was growling curses under her breath. Though he did not understand why she was not the one who had to marry the last person on earth she wanted to, a noble woman, all cool reserve, and her nose in the air, when he liked barmaids with ready smiles and willing eyes. The heir to a throne, and not just any throne. The crystal throne, the imperial throne of Seanchan. A woman who spun his head like a top and left him wondering whether he held her captive or she held him. When fate gripped you by the throat, there was nothing to do but grin. He kept a jaunty pace till he was inside of the windowless purple wagon. And then he missed a step, a cluster of acrobats, 4 limbermen who called themselves the Chabana brothers. Though it was plain as their noses, they came from different countries, not just different mothers, rushed out of a green wagon nearby, shouting and gesturing wildly at one another. They spared a glance for the purple wagon and another for Matt. But they were too engrossed in their argument, and trotting too fast for more. Gordoran was leaning against one of the purple wheels, scratching his head and frowning at the 2 women who stood at the foot of the wagon's wooden steps. 2 women, both swathed in dark cloaks, faces concealed. Yet there was no mistaking the flowered headscarf hanging out of the taller woman's cowl. Well, he should have known Tuon would want her maid along. Noble women never went anywhere without a maid better penny, or better crown in the end. It all came down to a toss of the dice just the same. They had had their chance to betray him. Still, he was betting on a woman making the same choice twice, running on 2 women doing it. What fool would make odds? On that, but he had to toss the dice, except they were already rolling. He met Celia's cold blue stare with a smile, and swept off his hat to make an elegant leg to 2 on not too showy, with just a small flourish of his cloak. "Are you ready to go shopping?" He very nearly called her my lady, but until she was willing to say his name, "I have been ready for an hour." Toy rolled coolly, casually lifting an edge of his cloak. She glanced at the red silk lining and dyed his coat before letting the cloak fall. "Lace suits you. Perhaps I will have lace added to your robes if I make you a cupbearer." His smile slipped for an instant. Could you still make him do a veil if she married him? He would have to ask again. Light. Why did women never make it easy? "Do you want me to come along?" "My lord?" Gordoran asked slowly, not quite looking at the women. Now he tucked his thumbs behind his belt and did not quite look at Matt either. Just Carrie, maybe. Tuon did not say a word. She just stood there looking up at Matt, waiting, big eyes. Getting cooler by the second, the dice bounced and rattled in his head. Well, he only hesitated a heartbeat before jerking his head to send the red arm away. Maybe 2 heartbeats. He had to trust his luck. Trust her word. Trust is the sound of death he stepped on. That thought hard. This was no song, and no old memory could guide him. The dice inside his skull kept spinning with a slight bow. He offered his arm, which Tuon examined as if she had never seen an arm before, pursing those full lips. Then she gathered her cloak and set off with Celia, gliding at her heels, leaving him to hurry after them. No, women never did make it easy, despite the early hour. 2 burly fellows with cudgels were already guarding the entrance, and a third with a clear glass pitcher to take the coins and dump them. Through a slot in the iron-strapped box on the ground, each of the 3 looked too clumsy to palm a copper, without falling on his face, but Luca took no chances. 20 or 30 people were already waiting inside the heavy ropes that led to the big blue banner naming Luca Show, and unfortunately Littell was there too, stern-faced, in a dress sewn with crimson spangles and a cloak sewn with blue Luca's wife trained bears. Matt thought the bears did their tricks for fear she might bite them. "I have everything in hand," he told her. "Believe me, there's nothing to worry about. He might as well have spared his breath." Littell ignored him, frowning worriedly at Tuon and Seleucia. She and her husband were the only two showfolk who knew who they were. There had seemed no reason to tell either about this morning's jaunt. Luca, at least, would have had kittens. The sterile shifted to Matt was not worried. "Just stone hard, remember," she said quietly. "If you send us to the gallows, you send yourself." Then she sniffed and went back to studying the people waiting to get in. Littell was even better than Luca at judging the weight of a purse before the drawstrings were undone. She was also 10 times tougher than her husband. The dice tumbled on whatever had set them spinning. He had not yet reached the fateful point, the deciding point. She is a good wife for Master Luca, too. Unmurred when they had gone a little way, Matt looked at her sideways and resettled his hat on his head. There had been no mockery in her tone. Did she hate Luca that much? Or was she saying what sort of wife she would be, or burn him? He could go as crazy as Dolman thought. He was trying to puzzle this woman out. She had to be the reason for the feel of the dice in his head. What was she going to do? It was a short walk away from the rising sun to the town, along a hard-packed road through hills that were treeless here. But people dotted the road the way windmills and salt pans dotted the hills. Staring straight ahead, they moved so purposefully, they seemed not to see anyone in front of them. Matt dodged a round-faced man and nearly walked right into him, which made him have to jump. Away from a white-haired old fellow making a good speed on spindly legs that put him in front of a plump girl who would have run up the front of him if he had not jumped again. "Are you practicing a dance toy?" Tuon said, peering up at him over a slim shoulder. Her breath made a faint white mist in front of her cowl. "It isn't very graceful." He opened his mouth just to point out how crowded the road was, and suddenly he realized he could no longer see anyone beyond her and Seanchan. The people who had been there were just gone, the road empty as far as he could see before it made a bend. Slowly, he turned his head. There was no one between him and the show either, just the folk waiting in line, and that looked no longer than before beyond the show. The road wound into the hills toward a distant forest. Empty, not a soul in sight. He pressed fingers against his chest, feeling the fox-head medallion through his coat, just a piece of silver on a rawhide cord. He wished it felt cold as Ice Tuon arched an eyebrow. Seleucia's stare named him fool. "I can't buy you a dress standing here," he said. That was the point of this expedition, his promise to find Tuon something better than dresses that hung on her and made her look like a child in grown-up's clothing. At least he was pretty sure he had promised that, and she was perfectly certain. The needlework of the show's seamstresses met with Tuon's approval, but not the cloth they had available. Performers' costumes glittered with spangles and beads in bright colors, but the cloth was usually whatever could be found cheaply, those who had better kept it and used it till it wore out, juried, or made its money from salt. Though when salt made a great deal of money, the town's shops should offer any sort of material. A woman could wish there was no finger wiggling. This time Tuon shared a look with Seanchan. The taller woman shook her head, a wry ruffled twist to her mouth. Tuon shook her head, and they gathered their cloaks and started toward the town's iron-studded gates. Women. He hurried to catch up again. They were his prisoners, after all. They were. Their shadows stretched out, long in front of them. Had any of those people cast shadows before they vanished? He could not recall any of them breathing a mist either. It hardly seemed to matter, they were gone, and he was not going to think about where they had come from or where they had gone. Probably something to do with being Tiveran. He was going to put it out of his head. He was the dice rattling away, left room for nothing else. The gate guard seemed incurious about strangers, or at least about a man and 2 women, a foot hard-faced fellows in white-painted breastplates and conical helmets, with what looked like horsetails. For crests, they ran in passive eyes over the cloaked women, lingering suspiciously a moment on Matt for some reason, and then returned to leaning on their halyards and staring blankly at the road. They were local men, most likely in any case, not Seanchan, the salt merchants, and the local lady Ethan, who apparently said whatever the salt merchants told her to, had sworn the oaths of return without hesitation, and offered to pay a salt tax before they were asked. No doubt the Seanchan would get around to installing some sort of official here eventually, just to keep an eye on everything, but for the moment they had more important uses for their soldiers. Mat had sent Tom and Julan both to make sure there were no Seanchan and Juridor. Before agreeing to this excursion, a fool could trip over his own luck if he was not careful. It was a prosperous, busy town. Juridor with stone-paved streets, most of them wide, and all lined with stone buildings. Roofed in reddish tiles, houses and inns rub shoulders with stables and taverns, in a noisy jumble with a blacksmith's clanging hammer on an anvil. Here and the racketing of a rug weaver's looms there and everywhere. It seemed coopers, hammering bands on tight barrels for transporting salt hawkers, cried pins and ribbons, meat pies and roasted nuts from trays, or winter-wrinkled turnips and sorry plums from boreros on every street. Men and women stood guard over the display goods on narrow tables in front of their shops, and bellowed lists of what was offered within. Picking out the salt merchants' houses was easy. Though 3 stories of stone, rather than 2 covering 8 times as much ground as any others, each with a column walk overlooking the street and shielded by white row iron screens between the columns, the lower windows on most houses had those screens, though not always painted. That much was reminiscent of Abuar, but little else was beyond the olive complexions of the people. There were no deep necklines exposing cleavage here, no skirts sewn up to display-coloured petcoats. The women wore embroidered dresses with high necks right up to their chins, a little embroidery for the common folk, a great deal for the richer, who wore cloaks, embroidered top to bottom, and sheer veils hanging over their faces from combs of goldwork, or carved ivory stuck into dark coiled braids. The men's short coats were worked almost as thickly in colours, just as bright and rich or poor. Most men wore a long belt knife with a blade a little less curved than those in Abu Buda. Rich or poor, the fellows did have a tendency to funnel their knife, hilts as if expecting a fight. So maybe that was the same. The Lady Ethelyn's palace appeared no different from the outside than the salt merchants' mansions. But it was located in the town's main square, a wide expanse of polished stone, where a broad, round marble fountain sprayed water into the air. People filled their buckets in big pottery water jars from pipes, spilling into stone basins at the corners of other squares, though the big fountain put out a smell of brine. It was a symbol of Juridor's wealth, pumped from the same source as the salt wells in the surrounding hills. Mat got to see a good deal of the town before the sun climbed even halfway to its noon peak. Every time Tuon and Seleucia spotted a shop with silks displayed out front, they stopped at the long, narrow table to feel bolts of cloth and whisper, with their heads together, waving off the attentions of the watchful shopkeeper. Those kept a very watchful eye until they realized Mat was with the 2 women in their stout woolens, well-worn and badly fitting. They did not look like customers for silk. Mat, with one side of his cloak thrown back to expose the lining, did whenever he tried to show an interest, though women said they wanted you to show an interest whenever he got close enough to hear what they were saying. The women fell silent and looked at him, cool dark eyes and cool blue staring out of their deep cows, until he fell back a step or 2. Then Seleucia would bend her head to Tuon's, and they would go back to murmuring and fingering. Silk red silk, blue silk, green silk, smooth shimmering silk, and brocaded silk. Juridor was a very wealthy town. Luckily, he had tucked a fat purse of gold into his coat pocket. None of it seemed to be right, though. Inevitably, Tuon shook her head, and the pair of them glided away into the crowd, with Mat hurrying to keep up as far as the next shop showing silks. The dice continued to bounce off the inside of his skull. They were not the only ones from the show who had come into the town. He spotted a Ludra, her face framed by beaded braids, walking through the crowd with a grey-haired man who had to be a salt merchant from the amount of bright embroidery covering his silk coat and flowers and hummingbirds. What would the illuminator want with a salt merchant? Whatever she was saying to him. His pleased smile had added a few creases to his face, and he was nodding. Tuon shook her head, and the 2 women glided toward the next shop, ignoring the shopkeeper's deep bows. Well, most of those were directed at Mat. Maybe the skinny fool thought he wanted to buy silk for himself. Not that he would have passed up a new silk coat or 3. But who could think about coats when he was waiting for those bloody dice to stop? Just a little embroidery on the sleeves and shoulders. Tom went by, clutching his bronze-cold cloak around him, knuckling his long white mustaches and yawning as if he had spent the night awake. He might have the gleeman had not taken to drink again. But Lyn and Narim complained about him remaining awake till all hours burning a lamp so he could read and reread his precious letter. What could be so fascinating in a letter from a dead woman? A dead woman light. Maybe there's people on the road. No, he was not going to think about that at all. Tuon plucked one fold of silk and let it drop as she turned away without trying. Another Seleucia gave the stout shopkeeper such a stare before following that the woman started back in affront. Mat offered her a smile. Affronted shopkeepers could lead to town guards asking questions, and who could say where that might lead? He knew he could smile. Most women into feeling soothed. The round-faced woman sniffed at him and bent to smoothing the bolt of silk as tenderly as tucking in a babe. Most women, he thought sourly. Down the street, a woman in a plain cloak let her hood fall back and Mat's breath caught in his throat. Edina lifted her cowl again, but she took no hurry with it, and the damage was done anyway, and Aes Sedai's ageless face displayed for anyone who knew what they were seeing. No one in the street gave a sign that they had noticed anything, but he could not see. Every face was anyone thinking of a reward. There might be no Seanchan in Jodor at the moment, but they did pass through. Edina glided around a corner, and 2 dark-cloaked shapes followed her. 2 had the Suldam left only one of their number in the camp to watch. 2 eyes had eye, or maybe Jolene or Teslan was somewhere close by, and he had missed seeing her. He craned his neck, searching the throng for another plain cloak, but everyone he saw had at least a little embroidery. Abruptly it hit him like a stone between the eyes. Every cloak he could see had at least a little embroidery. Where were bloody Tuon and bloody Seleucia? Were the dice spinning faster? Breathing hard, he went up on his toes, but the street was a river of embroidered cloaks, embroidered coats and dresses. It did not mean they were trying to escape. Tuon had given her word. She had passed up a perfect chance for betrayal. But all either woman had to do was say 3 words, and anyone who heard them likely would recognize a Shan accent that might be sufficient to set the hounds on his trail. There were 2 shops ahead that seemed to be offering cloth, one on either side of the street. Neither were the pair of dark-cloaked women at the tables out front. They could have turned a corner easily enough. But he had to trust to luck. His luck was especially good when the game was random. Bloody women probably thought it was a bloody game. Burn him. Let his luck run good. Closing his eyes, he spun in a circle in the middle of the street and took a step at random. He bumped into someone solid hard enough to make them both grunt. A bulky fellow with a small mouth and a little poorly done scroll work on the shoulders of his rough coat stood glaring at him when he opened his eyes, glaring and fingering the hilt of his curved knife. Mat did not care. He was facing straight at one of the 2 shops. Pulling his hat down tight, he ran. The dice were rolling faster. Divided shelves stuffed with bolts of cloth lined the walls of the shop from floor to ceiling, and more stood stacked on long tables out in the floor. The shopkeeper was a scrawny woman with a large mole on her chin, her assistant slim and pretty and angry-eyed. He dashed inside just in time to hear the shopkeeper say, "For the last time, if you won't tell me what you're here for, I'm going to send Nelson for the guards." Tuon and Seleucia, faces still hidden in their hoods, were walking slowly along one wall full of cloth, stopping to touch a bolt, but neither paying the shopkeeper any heed. "They're with me," Mat said breathlessly. Tugging the purse from his pocket, he tossed it on the nearest clear table. The heavy clink it made landing put a wide smile on the shopkeeper's narrow face. "Give them whatever they want," he told her. And Tuon, he added firmly, "If you're going to buy anything, it's going to be here. I've had all the exercise I care for this morning." He would have had the words back as soon as they left his mouth if he could speak to a woman that way. And she flared in your face like one of Aludra's fire sticks every time. But Tuon's big eyes looked up at him from the shelter of her hood, and her full mouth curved slightly in a smile. It was a secret smile for herself, not him. The light only knew what it meant. He hated it when women did that. At least the dice had not stopped. That had to be a good sign, right? Tuon had no need of words to make her choices, silently pointing out bolt after bolt and measuring with her small dark hands how much the shopkeeper was to cut off with her shears. The woman did the work herself instead of delegating it to her assistant, and well she might, considering red silk and several shades went under those long sharp scissors, and green silk and a few shades and more varieties of blue silk than Mat knew existed. Tuon chose out some fine linen in several thicknesses and lengths of bright wool. She consulted Seleucia over those in muffled whispers, but mostly it was silk. He got back much less of his purse than he had expected. Once all that cloth had been folded and neatly tied, then bundled into a larger length of coarse linen at no extra charge. "Thank you very much." It made a mound as fat as a peddler's pack. It did not surprise him at all to learn that he was expected to carry the thing across his shoulders, with his hat dangling in one hand. "Dress your best by a woman's silk, and she still found a way to make you work." Maybe she was making him pay for speaking firmly. He earned plenty of stares from gaping fools as he made his way out of the town. Behind the two women they glided along. Smuggler's cats full of cream, even cloaked and hooded their backs, said it all. The sun was still well short of midday, but the line of people waiting to get into the show stretched down the road. Almost to the town, most gaped and pointed as if he were a painted fool. One of the big horse handlers guarding the coin box gave a gap-toothed smirk and opened his mouth, but Matt returned him a level look, and the fellow decided to put his eyes back on the coins, going from townsfolk to glass pitcher to box mat. Thought he had never been so relieved to be inside Luca's show before he and the two women had gotten 3 steps inside the entrance. Julian came running up for a wonder without Thera or his red cap. The thief-catcher's face could have been carved from ancient oak, eyeing the people flowing past them into the show. He pitched his voice low and urgent. "I was coming to find you. It's a Gnan. She's been hurt. Come quickly." The man's tone said enough, but worse. Matt realized the dice in his head were drumming. Now he flung the pack of cloth at the horse handlers with a hasty injunction to guard it as close as the coin box, or he would set the women on them, but he did not wait to see whether they took him seriously. Julian darted back the way he had come at a run, and Matt ran after him along the wide main street of the show, where noisy, gawking crowds were watching the 4 bare-chested Shavana brothers stand on one another's shoulders, and contortionists in filmy trousers and glittering vests sit on their own heads, and a slack rope walker in spangled blue breeches climbing a long wooden ladder to begin her performance short of the slack rope walker. Julian dodged into one of the narrower streets where laundry hung from lines between the tents and wagons. Performers sat on stools and wagon steps, waiting to go on and show. Children ran playing with balls and hoops. Matt knew where they were headed now, but the thief-catcher ran too fast to overtake ahead. He saw his green wagonlet was peering underneath, and Luca, in one of his bright red cloaks, was waving a pair of jugglers to move along the two women in baggy trousers and with faces painted white. Like a noble's fools took a good look under the wagon before they obeyed. As he came closer, he could see what they had been staring at. Coatless Dolman was sitting on the ground under the edge of the wagon, cradling a limp. Elayne in his arms, her eyes were closed, and a trickle of blood ran from the corner of her mouth. Her wig hung askew. That stood out for some reason. She always fussed so to keep that wig straight. The dice beat like thunder. "This could be disaster," Luca growled, splitting his glower between Matt and Julian. It was an angry glower, though not frightened. "You may have brought me to disaster." He shared away a gaggle of wide-eyed children and growled at a plump woman in skirts that glittered with silvery spangles. Miura made leopards do tricks that even Latella would not try, but she merely tossed her head before gliding off. No one took Luca as seriously as he took himself. The man gave a start, when Tuon and Seleucia hurried up and looked on the point of telling them to go too, before he thought better of it. In fact, he began to frown thoughtfully and worriedly. It seemed his wife had not told him about Matt and the women leaving the show, and it was clear they had been somewhere. The blue-eyed woman had the huge bundle of cloth on her back now, with her arms doubled behind her, though she stood straight. Despite the bulk, you would think a lady's maid was used to carrying things, but her face was a picture of frustrated irritation. Let eyed her up and down, then sneered at Matt as if he were the reason the woman was thrusting her considerable bosom out. Luca's wife was very good at sneering, yet Tuon's stern expression made the tell nearly look mild. A judge peered out of her cowl. A judge ready to pass sentence for the moment. Matt did not care what the women thought. Those bloody dice tossing his cloak back, he went to one knee and touched fingers to Ainan's throat. Her pulse beat weakly, thin and fluttering. "What happened?" he asked. "Have you sent for one of the sisters?" Moving again might be enough to kill her, but there might be time for healing if the eyes were quick. He was not about to say that name aloud, though. With people walking by, pausing for curious stares before Luca or Latelle hurried them on. Everyone moved quicker for her than for him. Let herself, was the only one who really jumped for Luca. Rena Dolman spat the name despite his short cap of hair, that illy on her beard that left his upper lip bare. He did not look ridiculous now. He looked afraid and murderous, a dangerous combination. I did see her stab Enon in the back and run. If I could have reached her, I would have broken her neck. But my hand be all that's holding Einan's blood in, where be that bloody eyes, he snarled so much for being careful with his tongue. I be right here. Bail Doman Teslan announced coldly. Rushing up with the Who took one horrified look at Tuon and Seleucia and latched onto Julian's arm with a squeak, eyes on the ground, the way she began trembling. She might be there herself in a minute. The heart-eyed eye said, I made her face as if she had a mouthful of briars when she saw what lay in front of her, or maybe where it lay, but she swiftly crashed underneath the wagon beside Dolman and clasped a Janan's head in her bony hands. Jolene, to be better at this than I, she muttered half under her breath, but I may be able. The silver fox head went cold against Matt's chest, and Aginan jerked so violently that her wig fell off, nearly pulling herself out of Dolman's grasp, as her eyes popped open wide. The convulsion lasted only long enough for her to sit halfway up with a frozen gasp. Then she slumped back against Dolman's chest, panting, and the medallion became just a piece of worked silver again. He was almost accustomed to that. He hated being accustomed to that. Teslan slumped too, on the point of falling over, until Dolman shifted his grip on again to steady the eyes with one hand. Thank you, Tessin said, after a moment the words sounding dragged from her, but I need no help. She used the side of the wagon to help arise, though her cold eyes at eye gaze daring anyone to comment. The blade did slide on her rib, and so did Mr. Hart. All she does need now be rest in food. She had not delayed to grab a cloak. Matt realized in one direction along the narrow street, a clutch of women in spangled cloaks was watching from in front of a green striped tent, their gazes intent and focused in the other half. A dozen men and women in white striped coats and tight breeches, acrobats who performed on horseback, darted looks toward Teslan between putting their heads together to whisper, too late to worry about someone recognizing an ice face, too late to worry that one of them knew healing when he saw it done. The dice battered at the inside of Matt's head. They had not stopped. The game was not played out yet. Who's looking for Julian? He asked. Julian. The thief-catcher gave over, glaring at Tuon and Seleucia and murmuring to Thera, though he continued to pat the trembling woman Vannon and the red arms Lenin and Narim Oliver too. He was away before I could catch him. But in this he stopped soothing the long enough to gesture toward the main street. The babble of voices was clearly audible even at this distance. All she needs is to lay hands on one of those fancy cloaks, and she can slip out with the first folk to leave if we try stopping every woman with her hood up, or even try looking inside. We'll have a riot on our hands. These people are touchy disaster, Luca moaned, wrapping his cloak around himself tightly. Let put an arm around him. It must have been like being comforted by a leopard, but in any case Luca did not look much comforted. Burn me, why? Matt growled. Rena was always ready to lick my bloody wrist, I thought. If anybody went over the edge, he did not even glance at Thera, but Julian still scowled at him darkly. Dolman had stood up with Ainan in his arms. She struggled feebly at first. Egwene was not a woman to let herself be carried about like a doll, but eventually she seemed to realize that if she did make her own feet, she would fall over. She sagged against the Ileana's chest with a resentful glower. Dolman would learn even when a woman needed help if she did not want it. She made you pay for giving it. I'm the only one who knew her secret. She drawled in a weak voice, the only one who might give it away. At least, she may have thought it would be safe to go home with me. Dead. What secret? Matt asked the woman, hesitated for some reason, frowning at Dolman's chest. Finally she sighed. Rena was leashed once, so are Bethamin and Sita. They can channel, or maybe learn to. I don't know. But the Edom worked on those three. Maybe it works on any Sulam. Matt whistled through his teeth. Now that would be a kick in the head for the Shachan Luca, and his wife exchanged puzzled glances, plainly not understanding a word. Teslan's mouth hung open, eyes serenity washed away in shock. Susia made an angry sound, though blue eyes blazing, and dropped the bundle of cloth from her back as she took a step toward Doman. A quick flash of Tuon's fingers stopped her in her tracks. Though it was a quivering halt, Tuon's face was a dark mask, unreadable. She did not like what she had heard, though. Come to think, she had said she trained Damani O'Burnham on top of everything else he was going to marry a woman who could channel the sound of horses. Hooves, announced Horn, and the other 3 red arms coming along the narrow way between the tents and wagons. At a quick trot, their swords were belted down under their cloaks, Meatwin with a dagger, almost as long as a short sword to boot, and Gorderon had his heavy crossbow hanging at his saddle already drawn and latched. The crank at his belt would take a full minute to pull back the thick cord, but this way, all he need do was place a bolt. Arnon carried a double-curved horsebow with a bristling quiver at his hip. Fergan was. Leading Pip's Arn did not bother dismantling, eyeing Tuon and Seleucia suspiciously, and Luca and Latel, with almost as much doubt, he leaned down from his saddle, the crude hawk tattoo sharp on his cheek. "Rhaena stole a horse, my lord," he said quietly. "Rode down one of the horse handlers at the entrance, getting out. Vannon's following her. He says she could reach Corman sometime tonight. That's the way she's headed. She's moving a lot faster than the wagons did, but she's riding bareback. We can catch her with luck." He sounded as if that luck were a matter of fact. The men of the band trusted Matt Coffin's luck more than he did himself. There did not seem to be any choices. Really, the dice were still pounding in his head. There was still a chance they might fall his way. A small chance. Matt Coffin's luck. "Get your people on the road as fast as they can. Pack up, Luca," he said, stepping up onto Pips. "Leave the wall, and anything else you can't get onto the wagons fast. Just go. Are you crazy?" Luca spluttered. "If I try to chase those people out, I will have a riot and they'll want their coin back like the..." Man would think of money with his neck stretched on the headsman's block. "Think what you'll have if 1,000 Seanchan find you here tomorrow." Matt's voice was as cold as he could make it if he failed. The Seanchan would run. Luca showed down in short order, however fast they flogged their horses. Luca knew it too from the twist of his mouth, as if he had just bitten a rotting plum. Matt made himself ignore the man. The dice were drumming hard, but they had not stopped yet. Julian leave all the gold for Luca except one good purse. Maybe the man could bribe his way clear once the Seanchan saw he did not have their daughter of the 9 bloody moons. "Gather everybody and ride out as soon as you can, once you're out of sight of the town. Take to the forest, I'll find you everybody sheltering." Thera with his body. Jewel jerked his head toward Tuon and Seleucia. "Leave those 2, and Durador and the Sharkan might stop with getting them back. It might slow them down at least. You keep saying you're going to turn them loose. Sooner or later." Matt met Tuon's eyes, big, dark, liquid eyes, in a smooth, expressionless face. She had pushed her hood back a little so he could see her face clearly if he left her behind. Then she could not say the words, or if she did, he would be too far away for the words to matter. If he left her behind, he would never learn why she smiled those mysterious smiles, or what lay behind the mystery light. He was a fool. Pips danced a few impatient steps. "Everybody," he said. Did Tuon nod slightly, as if to herself? Why would she nod? "Let's ride," he told Harren. They had to walk their horses through the crowds to get out of the show, but as soon as they reached the road, Matt put Pips to a gallop cloak streaming behind and head down to keep his hat from blowing off. It was not a pace you could keep a horse at for long. The road wound around hills and crossed ridges, occasionally cutting through where the rise was not too high. They splashed across ankle-deep streams and thundered over low wooden bridges. Crossing deeper water, trees began to appear on the slopes again, pine and leather leaf showing green among the winter bare branches of the others. Farms clung to some of the hills' low tile-roofed stone houses and taller barns. And now and then, a hamlet of 8 or 10 houses a few miles from the show. Matt spotted a wide man ahead of them, sitting a saddle like a sack of sow. The horse was a leggy dun eating ground at a steady trot. It figured that a horse thief had an eye for a good animal, catching the sound of their hooves. Van looked back, but he only slowed to a walk that was bad. When Matt slowed Pips beside the dun, Vannon spat. "Best wager we got is we find her horse run to death so I can track her afoot from there," he muttered. "She's pushing. Harder than I figured with her bareback if we push. We can maybe catch her by sunset if her horse don't founder or die. That's about the time she'll make Coromyn." Matt tipped back his head to glance at the sun almost straight overhead. It was a long way to cover in less than half a day if he turned back. It could be a good distance the other side of Durador by sunset, in company with Tom and Julian and the others, with Tuon, with the Seanchan, knowing to hunt Matt Carin, the man who had kidnapped the daughter of the 9 moons, could not own enough luck to get off with being made duck. and sometime, tomorrow or the next day, they would plant Luca on an impaling stake. Luca and Letel, Petra and Clarine, and the rest. A thicket of impaling stakes, the dice rattled and bounced in his head. "We can make it," he said. There was no other choice. Bannon spat. There was only one way to cover a great deal of ground quickly on a horse if he meant to be on a live horse. At the end, they walked the animals for half a mile, then trotted half a mile the same at a canter, then a run, and it was back to a walk. The sun began to slide downward and the dice spun around sparsely forested. Hills and over tree-topped ridges, streams that could be crossed in 3 strides, barely wetting the horses' hooves, and streams 30 paces across with flat ridges of wood or sometimes stone. The sun sank lower and lower, and the dice spun faster and faster, almost back to the Elayne, and no sign of Rena, except scuffs on the hard dirt of the road that Vannon pointed to as if they were painted signs. "Getting close now," the fat man muttered. He did not sound happy, though. Then they rounded a hill, and there was another low bridge ahead beyond the road twisted north to cross the next ridge. Through a saddle, the sun sitting at top. The ridge blazed in their eyes. Corman lay on the other side of that ridge, pulling his hat lower for shade. Matt searched the road for a woman, for anyone mounted or afoot, and his heart sank. Vannon cursed and pointed. A leathered bay was laboring its way up the slope on the other side of the river. A woman frantically kicking its flanks, urging it to climb. Rena had been too anxious to reach the Seanchan to stick with the road. She was maybe 200 paces from them, and she might as well have been miles. Her mount was on the point of collapsing, but she could get down and run within the sight of the garrisons before they could reach her. All she had to do was reach the crest. Another 50 FT. "My lord," Arnon said. He had an arrow nocked and his bow half raised. Gordoran held the heavy crossbow to his shoulder, a thick pointed bolt in place. Matt felt something flicker and die inside him. He did not know what something. "The dice rolled like thunder shoot," he said. He wanted to close his eyes. The crossbow snapped. The bolt made a black streak through the air. Rena slammed forward when it hit her back. She had almost managed to push herself erect against the bay's neck. When Han's arrow took her slowly, she toppled from the horse, sliding down the slope, rolling, bouncing off saplings, tumbling faster and faster, until she splashed into the stream for a moment. She floated face down against the bank, and then the current caught her and pulled her away, skirts billowing up on the water. Slowly she drifted toward the Eldar. Maybe eventually she would reach the sea, and that made 3. It hardly seemed to matter that the dice had stopped that. Made 3 never again, he thought as Rena floated out of sight around a bend. If I die for it, never again. They did not press, riding back eastward. There was no point, and Matt felt too bone-weary. They did not stop, though, except to breathe and water the horses. No one wanted to talk. It was the small hours of the night when they reached Juridor, the town, a dark mass with the gates shut tight. Clouds covered the moon. Surprisingly, the canvas walls of Lucas' show were still in place, just beyond the town, with a pair of bulky men wrapped in blankets snoring unaware beneath the big banner as they guarded the entrance. Even from the road in the dark, it was plain that wagons and tents filled the space behind the wall. "At least I can tell Luca he doesn't have to run after all," Matt said wearily, turning pips toward the banner. "Maybe he'll give us a place to sleep a few hours." For all the gold he had left, Luca should give him his own wagon. But knowing the man Matt had hopes for clean straw somewhere tomorrow, he would set out to find Tom and the others, and Tuon tomorrow. When he had rested, a greater shock waited inside Luca's huge wagon. It truly was roomy inside, at least for a wagon with a narrow table sitting in the middle and space to walk around it. Table cupboards and shelves all were polished till they glowed. Tuon was sitting in a gilded chair. Luca would have a chair and gilded when everybody else made do with stools. With Seleucia standing at her back, a beaming, Luca was. Watching Letel offer Tuon a plate of steaming pastries, which the dark little woman was examining as if she would actually eat something that Luca's wife had cooked. Tuon showed no surprise at all at Matt walking into the wagon. "Is she captured or dead?" she said, picking up a pastry with her fingers curved in that curiously graceful way. "Dead," he said flatly. "Luca, what in the light? I forbid it," Tuon snapped, pointing a finger at him sharply. "I forbid you to mourn a traitor." Her voice softened slightly, but it remained firm. She earned death by betraying the Empire. And she would have betrayed you as easily she was trying to betray you. What you did was justice, and I name it so." Her tone said that if she named a thing, then it was well and truly named. Matt squeezed his eyes shut for a moment. "Is everyone else still here too?" he demanded. "Of course," Lucas said, still smiling like a bull-goose fool. The High Lady, forgive me, High Lady." He bowed deeply. "She talked to Marilyn and Sandar, and well, you see how it was a very persuasive woman. The High Lady coffin about my gold, you said they were to hand it over. But Marilyn said he'd slit my throat first, and Sand threatened to crack my head, and he trailed off under Matt's stare, then suddenly frightened again. Look what the lady gave me." Snatching open one of the cupboards, he pulled out a folded paper that he held reverently in both hands. It was thick paper and white as snow. Expensive a warrant, not sealed, of course, but signed Valen Luca's grand traveling show and magnificent display of marvels and wonders, is now under the personal protection of the highlighted Tuon Cora, and everyone will know who that is, of course. I could go to Seanchan, I could put on my show for the Empress. May she live forever, he added hastily with another bow to Tuon for nothing. Matt thought bleakly. He sank down on one of the beds with his elbows on his knees, earning a very pointed look from Littell, likely only Tuon's presence kept her from clouding him. Tuon raised a peremptor hand, a black porcelain doll but every inch a queen. "Despite the shabby, too-large dress, you are not to use that except at need." "Master Luca." "Great need, of course, High Lady." "Of course, Luca." Bobbed bows as if he might be kissing the floorboards any minute, all for a bloody nothing. "I did make specific mention of who is not under my protection." Toy Tuan took a bite of pastry and delicately brushed a crumb from her lip with a finger. "Can you guess whose name heads that list?" She smiled. Not a malicious smile, another of those smiles for herself. Amusement or delight in something he could not see. Suddenly he noticed something. That little cluster of silk rosebuds he had given her was pinned to her shoulder. Despite himself, Matt began to laugh. He threw his hat down on the floor and laughed with everything, all his efforts. He did not know this woman at all. Not a bit. He laughed until his ribs hurt. Chapter 30. What the Oath Rod Can Do. The sun sat on the horizon, perfectly silhouetting the white tower in the distance, but the cold of the previous night seemed to be deepening, and dark grey clouds marching across the sky threatened a snowfall. Winter was diminishing, yet it had clung past when spring should have begun, loosening its hold. Fitfully the noises of morning penetrated to Wayne's tent, isolated as it was from everything around it. The camp seemed to vibrate. Labourers would be bringing in water from the wells and extra measures of firewood and charcoal in carts. Serving women would be fetching sisters' breakfasts and novices in the second sitting, scurrying to theirs those in the first and third. To classes it was a momentous day, though none of them knew it. Likely today would see an end to the spurious negotiations that were going on in Darin, at a table under a pavilion at the foot of the bridge. To Tarvalin spurious on both sides, Elida's raiders continued to strike with impunity on the other side of the river. In any case, today would be the last meeting for some time, peering at her own breakfast. Egwene sighed and picked a tiny black fleck out of the steaming porridge, wiping it from her fingers on a linen napkin, without looking closely enough to be sure that it was a weevil if you could not be sure. Then you worried less about what remained in the bowl. She put a spoonful into her mouth and tried to concentrate on the sweet slivers of dried apricot that Chassa had blended in. Did something crack under her teeth? "It all feeds the belly, my mother used to say, so pay it no mind," Chassa murmured as if talking to herself. That was how she gave Egwene advice, without straying across the line between mistress and maid. At least she gave advice when Hail Lima was not present, and the other woman had left early this morning. Chaser was sitting on one of the clothing chests in case I wanted something or needed an errand run. But now and then, her eyes strayed to the pile of garments that were to go to the washwomen. Today, she never minded darning or mending in front of Egwene, but in her book, sorting laundry would have been stepping over that line, smoothing the grimace from her face. Egwene was about to tell the woman to go get her own breakfast. Chassa considered eating before Egwene finished another transgression. But before she could open her mouth, Nissa pushed into the tent, surrounded by the glow of Sidar as the entry flaps fell. Egwene caught a glimpse of Sarin Nissa's bald, black-bearded stump of a warder waiting outside the small sister's cowl, was down carefully arranged on her shoulders, so the yellow velvet lining showed, yet she was clutching her cloak as though she felt the cold intensely. She said nothing, just gave Chessa a sharp look. Chessa waited for Egwene's nod, gathered her own cloak, and skewered out. She might not be able to see the light of the power, but she knew when I wanted privacy. Chiron Stang is dead, Nisal said without preamble. Her face was smooth, her voice steady and chill, short enough to make Awan feel tall. She stood as though straining for an extra inch. Nisa did not usually do that. 7 sisters had already tested for resonance before I got there. There is no doubt she was killed using Sidene. Her neck was broken, shattered, as if her head had been wrenched around full circle. At least it was quick. Nisa drew a deep, unsteady breath, then realized what she had done and pulled herself up even straighter. Her warder is primed for murder. Someone gave him an herbal concoction to put him to sleep, but he will be trouble to handle once he wakes. She did not put the usual dismissive yellow twist on the mention of herbs, a measure of her upset no matter how calm her face was. Egwene set her spoon down on the tiny table and leaned back. Suddenly her chair did not feel comfortable anymore. Now the next best after Lyanna was Bodha Coffin, a novice she tried not to think of. What else? Bodha was with the extra days of practice. Bodha could do the work almost. As well as Chiron could have almost. She did not mention that, though Nisa knew some secrets, but not all Anaya. And now Chiron both. Blue A, do you know of any other link between them? Nis shook her head. Anaya had been Aes Sedai 50 or 60 years when Chiron came to the tower. As I recall, perhaps they had mutual acquaintances. I just don't know, Mother. Now she sounded tired and her shoulders slumped a little. Her quiet investigation into Anaya's death had gotten nowhere, and she had to be aware Egwene was going to add Chiron. Find out, Egwene ordered discreetly. This second murder would cause enough ruction without her adding to it. For a moment, she studied the other woman. Nisa might make excuses after the fact or claim she had been doubtful from the start, but until then, she was always a model of yellow A, self-assurance and absolute certainty. Not now, however, are many sisters walking about holding Saidar. I've noticed several, Mother Nisal said stiffly. Her chin rose within a fraction of defiance after a moment. Though the glow around her went out, she pulled her cloak tighter, as if she had suddenly lost warmth. I doubt it would have done Kern any good. Her death was too sudden, but it makes a person feel safer after the small woman left. Egwene sat stirring her porridge with her spoon. She did not see any more dark flecks, but her appetite was gone. Finally she rose and settled the 7-striped stole around her neck, then swung her cloak onto her shoulders. Today of all days, she would not sit mired in gloom. Today of all days, she must follow her routine exactly. Outside, high-wheeled carts trundled along the frozen ruts of the camp streets, filled with big water barrels or piles of split firewood and sacks of charcoal. The drivers and the fellows riding behind alike, enveloped in their cloaks against the cold. As usual, families of novices hurried along the wooden walkways, usually managing to make their courtesies to passing eyes. Sedai, without slowing failure in the proper respects, to a sister could earn a switching, but so could tardiness, and teachers were generally less tolerant than Aes Sedai encountered in passing, who at least might make allowances for why a novice went rushing by the white-clad women, still leapt out of the way at sight of the striped stole hanging from McQuain's cowl. Of course, but she refused to let her mood be soured any more than it already was by novices curtsying in the street, slipping and sliding on the ice-hard ground and sometimes almost falling on their faces before their cousins could grab them. Cousin was what members of the same family had taken to calling one another, and somehow that seemed to tie them closer together, as if they really were related and close cousins at that. What did sour her mood were the few Aes Sedai she saw out and about, gliding along the walkways through ripples of curtsies. There were no more than a dozen or so between her tent and the Armeline's study, but 3 out of every 4 were wrapped in the light of the power. As well as cloaks, they walked in pairs more often than not, followed by any warders they had. They seemed watchful too, enveloped in Saidar or not, cowls swiveling constantly as they scanned everyone in sight. It reminded her of the time spotted fever had struck Emond's Field, and everyone walked around clutching brandy-soaked handkerchiefs to their noses. Dol Baron the Wisdom then had said that would help stave it off, clutching their handkerchiefs and watching one another to see who would be the next to break out in spots and fall over. 11 people died before the fever ran its course, but it was a month after the last person fell sick, before anyone was willing to put those handkerchiefs away for a long time. She had associated the smell of brandy with fear. She could almost smell it now. 2 sisters had been murdered in their midst by a man who could channel, not to mention apparently being able to come and go as he chose. Fear was running through the eyes to die faster than spotted fever ever could. The tent she used as a study was already warm when she arrived, the brazier giving off a scent of roses. The mirrored stand lamps and table lamp were lit. Her routine was well, now hanging her cloak on the cloak rack in the corner. She took her seat behind the writing table, automatically catching the unsteady chair leg that always tried to fold. All she had to do was follow routine. Tomorrow she could announce what had been done. Her first visitor was a shock, perhaps the last woman she expected to walk into the tent. Theoden was a willowy, apple-cheeked brown, a copper-skinned Demani with a stubborn set to her mouth. Once she had always looked ready to smile, she glided across the worn carpets close enough for the fringe of her shawl to brush the writing table as she made a very formal curtsy. Egwene extended her left hand so the woman could kiss her great serpent ring. Formality must be met with. Formality. Romanda wishes to know if she can meet with you today, mother, the slender brown said softly, but there was a stubbornness buried in her tone too. Tell her at any time she chooses, daughter. Egwene replied carefully. Theoden offered another curtsy without changing expression, as the brown moved to leave. One of the accepted brushed by her into the tent, pushing back her banded white hood. Imara was a thin woman, and as small as Nissa, it seemed a strong wind might blow her away. Yet she had a very firm hand with the novices, is given into her care firmer than many sisters. But then she was hard on herself, and a novice's life was supposed to be hard. Imara's grey eyes rolled to the fringe on Theoden's shawl, and her mouth twisted into a scornful grin before she smoothed it away to spread her snowy banded skirts for Egwene. Bright spots of colour flamed on Theoden's cheeks. Egwene slapped a hand down on the table, hard enough to rattle the stone inkwell and the sand jar. "Have you forgotten how to be courteous to an Aes Sedai child?" she said sharply. Imara went pale. The Armlane did have a reputation after all, and hastily made an even deeper curtsy for Theoden, who acknowledged it with a wooden nod before gliding from the tent a good deal more swiftly than she had entered. What I stammered out in an Ileana accent, made thicker by nerves, was a request from Elayne to meet with the Amelin Romanda, and Elayne had been much less formal, once appearing unannounced, and whenever they wished, but the declaration of war on Elida had changed a great deal. Not everything, but enough to go on with. Egwene returned the same. She replied to Elayne that she had to ronda, though, in a more clipped tone, and Ira almost fell over, making her curtsy, and practically ran out of the tent, one more nail fastening together the legend of Egwene Alvir, the Armerland seat, who made Sorella Bagand look like a goose-down pillow as soon as the accepted was gone. Egwene raised her hand and frowned at what it had covered, the folded square of paper that Theoden had deposited on the table while kissing her ring. Her frown deepened when she opened it. The script that covered the small page managed to flow while being precise, but there was an ink blot on one edge. Theoden was very neat. Perhaps she was trying to conform to the general view of Browns. Romanda has sent 2 sisters to travel to Kyrie and investigate some tale that has the yellow sitters buzzing. "I don't know what the rumor is, mother, but I will find out," I heard one of them mention, naive. Not as if she were in Kyrie, but as if the rumor was somehow connected to her. The fool woman had even signed her name. "What is that, mother?" Egwene gave a start of surprise and barely caught the folding chair leg before it dropped her onto the carpets. She refocused her scowl on Swan, who stood just inside the entry flaps with her blue-fringed shawl on her arms and her leather folders pressed to her breasts. The blue-eyed woman's eyebrows raised slightly at Egwene's startlement. "Here," Egwene said irritably, thrusting the paper at her. This was no time to be jumping and twitching. "You know about Karen?" "Of course she must. But I still said, have you made the necessary changes?" "Necessary changes?" Light, she sounded as pompous as Randa. She was on edge. Only at the last did she think to embrace Sidar and weave a ward against eavesdropping. Only after the ward was in place did she think that today might not be the best time for anyone to think she had private matters to discuss with Swan. Swan was not on edge. She had weathered storms, and managed to recover from drowning. Some might say today was only a little windy to her. "No need until we know for sure about the boats, Mother," she replied calmly, setting her folders on the table and neatly squaring them between the inkwell and the sand jar. "The less time Boda has to think about it, the less chance she'll panic." Calm as a pond, even two murdered sisters could not ruffle Swan, or sending a novice of only a few months to replace one of them. A frown creased her forehead as she read the note. "Though first, Faile goes into hiding." She growled at the paper. "And now Theoden brings this to you, instead of to me. That fool has less brains than a fisher-bird. You'd think she wants someone to find out she's keeping an eye on Randa. For you keeping an eye, a polite way of saying spy. They were both practiced in euphemisms that went with being Aes Sedai today. Euphemisms grated on Egwene. Perhaps she does want to be discovered. Perhaps she's tired of Randa telling her what to do, what to say, what to think. "I had an accepted in here who sneered at Theoden's shawl, Swan." The other woman made a dismissive gesture. "Romanda tries to tell everyone what to do and what to think. As for the rest, things will change once Theoden and Faile can swear on the oath rod. I don't suppose anyone will actually insist they be tested for the shawl now. Until then, they must take what comes. That isn't good enough." Swan Egwene managed to keep her tone level, but it took an effort. She had at least suspected what she was letting those two in for when she told them to attach themselves to Romanda, and Lil. She had needed to know what the sitters were scheming at, and still needed to know, yet she had a duty to them. They had been the first to swear fealty to her, and of their own free will. Besides which, much of what's said about Theoden and Faile can be said of me too, if accepted, can show them disrespect. Well, she had no fear of that. The sisters were another matter, especially the sitters, Swan. "I have no hope at all of uniting the tower if Aes Sedai doubt me," Swan snorted forcefully, Mother. "By now even Elayne and Romanda know you're the Armerland seat. In truth, whether or not they'll admit it, that pair wouldn't have fallen in line with Diana Araman. I think they're beginning to see you as another Adana Nora governor." "That's as may be," I said dryly. Diana was considered the White Tower's savior after Bonwyn's disaster. With Arur Hawkwing Adorna was believed to have been the most politically skilled woman ever to hold. The staff and Stoll both had been very strong Armelins. But as you've reminded me, I have to make sure I don't end up like Shane Chunler. Shane had begun as a strong Armelin firmly in charge of the tower and the hall, and ended as a puppet doing exactly as she was told. Swan nodded in approval and agreement. She really was teaching Egwene the tower's history, and she often brought up Armelins who had misstepped fatally, including herself. "This is another matter, though," she muttered, tapping the note against her fingers. "When I lay my hands on Theoden, I'll make her wish she was a novice. And failing, if they think they can shirk off now, I swear, I'll gut the pair of them like grunts on the dock." "You'll gut who?" Shiriam asked, as she walked in through the ward in a gust of cold air. Egwene's chair almost dropped her onto the carpets again. She needed to get a chair that did not try to fold up every time she moved. She was willing to bet Adana never jumped, as if she had itch oak down her back. "No one who concerns you," Swan said calmly, putting the paper to one of the table lamp's flames. It burned quickly right to her fingertips, and then she mashed it out between her hands and brushed the ash away. Only Egwene, Swan, and Lyanna knew the truth of Faile and Theoden and the two sisters themselves. Of course, though there was a great deal neither of them knew, either Shairam accepted the rebuff with equanimity. The fire-haired woman seemed to have recovered completely from her collapse in the hall. At least she had recovered her outer dignity for the most part. Watching Swan burn the note, her tilted green eyes might have tightened a little, and she did touch the narrow blue stole hanging from her shoulders, as if to remind herself that it was there she did not have to accept Swan's orders. Putting her keeper in that position had seemed too harsh to Egwene in the end, but Shir knew very well that Swan had no need to accept her orders either, which had to gall her, now that Swan stood so far beneath her in the power, knowing there were secrets she was not privy to, had to gall her as well. Shiriam would have to live with it, though she also had brought a paper which she laid on the table in front of Egwene. "I met Tiana on the way here, Mother, and told her I'd give this to you." This was the day's report on runaways, though those no longer came every day or even every week, since the novices had been organized into families. Cousins supported one another through frustrations and tears and managed to talk one another out of the worst mistakes, Like running away, there was only one name on the page. Nicola Treehill. Egwene sighed and set the paper down. She would have thought Nicola's greed for learning would have kept her feet still, no matter how frustrated the woman grew, and yet she could not say she was sorry to see the end of her. Nicola was conniving and unscrupulous, willing to try blackmail or whatever else she thought would advance her. Very likely she had had help. Arena would not have balked at stealing horses for the pair of them to flee abruptly. The date beside the name caught her eye, 2 dates actually marked as questions. Months were seldom named, much less days numbered except in official documents and treaties signed, sealed, and witnessed in the city of Elon on the 12th day of Sovereign, this year of grace, and for reports of this nature, and entering a woman's name in the novice book for common use, so many days before this feast day, or after that sufficed. Written out dates always looked a little strange to her. She had to count on her fingers to be sure of what she saw. Nicola ran away 3 or 4 days ago. Sheriam and Tiana is just reporting it. She isn't even sure whether it was 3 days or 4. Nicola's cousins covered for her mother. Sheriam shook her head woefully, strangely. Her small smile seemed amused, though, or even admiring, not from love. Apparently they were glad to see the child go and afraid she'd be brought back. She was quite overbearing about her talent at foretelling. I'm afraid Tiana is very upset with them. None will be sitting comfortably in their classes today or for days to come. I fear Tiana says she intends to give them each a dose of the strap instead of breakfast every day till Nicola is found. I think she might relent, though, with Nicola gone so long before her flight was discovered. It may be some time before she's located. Egwene winced slightly. She could recall her own visits to the study of the Mistress of Novices, then occupied by the very woman in front of her. Sheriam had a strong arm. A daily dose would be fierce, but hiding a runaway's flight was more serious than sneaking out after hours or pulling a prank. She pushed the report to one side. Tiana will handle it as she sees fit. She said, Sheriam, has there been any change in how the sisters talk about my dream? She had revealed the dream about a Seanchan attack the very morning after dreaming it, and the women, she told, stared at her apathetically, apparently because of the freshness of Anaya's death that had stunned everyone, instead of answering. Sheriam cleared her throat and smoothed her blue-slashed skirts. You may not be aware, Mother, but one of Nicola's cousins is Lena Aelin from Emmonsfield. She added, as if Owen did not know that no one would think you were playing favorites if you pardoned the whole family. Whether or not she relents, Tiana does mean to be very sharp with them. In the meantime, they will suffer leaning back carefully because of the wobbly chair leg. Egwene frowned up at the other woman. Lena was almost the same. Age as she and a close friend growing up, they had spent hours together gossiping and practicing, putting their hair in braids for when the women's circle said they were old enough. Despite that, Lena had been one of the few Emmonsfield girls who seemed to accept that Egwene might really be the Armelin seat, though she showed it mainly by keeping her distance. But did Sheriam think Egwene would play favorites? Even Swan looked taken back. You should know better than anyone. Sheriam novice discipline is the province of the Mistress of Novices, unless a girl is being abused anyway and you haven't suggested that. Besides, if Lena thinks she can get away with helping a runaway today, helping a runaway Sheriam, what will she think she can get away with tomorrow? She can reach the shawl if she has the gumption to stick with it. I won't lead her down a path that ends with her being sent away for misbehavior. Now what are they saying about my dream? Sheriam's tilted green eyes blinked, and she glanced at Swan. Like the woman thought Egwene was being hard because Swan was present, because Swan might carry tales she should know better. She had been the Mistress of Novices, is the attitude among the sisters' mother, Sheriam said. Finally is still that the Seanchan are 1,000 miles away, they don't know how to travel, and if they start marching on Tarvallen, we'll learn of it before they're within 200 leagues. Swan muttered something under her breath that sounded vile, but not surprised Egwene wanted to curse. 2 worries over Anaya's murder had had nothing to do with the sisters' apathy. They did not believe that I was a dreamer. Anaya had been sure, but Anaya was dead, Swan. And Lyanna believed, yet neither stood high enough now to be listened to with more than impatient politeness. If that, and it was quite clear that Sheriam did not believe she obeyed her oath of fealty as scrupulously as Egwene could have wished for. But you could not order someone to believe they only mouthed what you told. Them and nothing changed when Shiriam left. Egwene found herself wondering what had brought the woman in the first place. Could it have been just to point out that Lena was going to be punished? Surely not, but she had said nothing else. Apart from answering Egwene's questions shortly, Muriel arrived, followed closely by Morin. Egwene could feel each of them release the source before she entered the tent, and they left their warders waiting outside, even in brief glimpses. As the entry flaps were pushed aside, the men looked weary even for warders. Muriel's big dark eyes flashed at the sight of Swan and her nostrils flared. Morven's round face remained smooth as polished stone, but she brushed her dark brown skirts with both hands, as if wiping something off. Perhaps it was unconscious. Unlike Shiriam, they did have to accept Swan's orders, and neither liked that at all. It was not that Egwene wanted to grind their noses, but she trusted Swan, and oaths, or no oaths. She did not entirely trust them, not to the degree she did Swan. Besides, there were times it was inconvenient, if not impossible for her to tell the sisters sworn to her what she wanted done. Swan could carry messages, and this way I could be sure they were obeyed. She asked about talk of her dreams straight away, but unsurprisingly their stories were the same as Shiriam's. The Seanchan were far off. There would be plenty of warning should that change. The story had been the same for a good week and a half worse. It might be different if Anaya were alive, Morven said, balancing atop one of the rickety stools in front of the writing table. In spite of her bulk, she did it easily and gracefully. Hanesia had a reputation for arcane knowledge. I always thought she should have chosen Brown myself if she said you were a dreamer. Her teeth clicked shut at a sharp look. From the Mirel suddenly took an interest in warming her hands at the brayer. Neither of them believed either except for Swan and Lyanna. No one in the whole camp believed that Egwene had had a true dream. Verilyn had taken over the talks in Darren Deefly, pushing Baonin into a lesser role, and she offered constant excuses as to why she could not pass on a warning at just this moment. Perhaps in a few days, when the talks were going more smoothly, as if they were ever anything other than sisters talking in circles without saying a word that might send the other side away, offended no one at all, but Swan and Lyanna. She thought they believed Mirel turned from the brayer as if steeling herself to put a hand on the Cole's mother. I've been thinking about the day Shada Logoth was destroyed. She broke off and turned back to the brayer as a long-faced woman in deep blue entered the tent, carrying a three-legged stool painted in bright spirals. Mygan was beautiful with large eyes and full lips, but she seemed elongated. Somehow she was not that tall, but even her hands seemed long. She gave Morven a cool nod and pointedly ignored Muriel. "I brought my own seat today, Mother," she said, making as much of a curtsy as she could with the stool in one hand. "Yours are rather unsteady, if I may say so." It had come as no surprise that Anaya's death meant the Blue Aja would name someone else to Egwene's advisory council, but she had hoped for the best when she learned who it was to be. Megan had been one of Swan's allies when Swan was Armelin. "Do you mind if I send Swan for tea, Mother?" Mygan said as she settled onto her stool. "You really should have a novice or accepted to run errands, but Swan will do the novices have their classes, daughter," Egwene replied. "And even with the arrangement of families, the accepted hardly have time for their own studies. Besides which she would have to send a novice or accepted to stand in the cold any time she wanted to speak to someone in privacy. Hard on one who would not yet have been taught how to ignore heat or cold, and a flag planted outside the tent, telling everyone there might be something worth eavesdropping on Swan. Will you please bring us some tea? I'm sure we could all do with a hot cup." Migan raised a long-fingered hand as Swan started for the entrance. "I have a jar of mint honey in my tent," she said imperiously. "Fetch that, and mind you don't filch any. I remember you used to have a sweet tooth." Hurry now. Migan had been an ally. Now she was one of many sisters who blamed Swan for breaking the White Tower, as you say. Mygan Swan replied in a meek voice, and even bent her knee slightly before she hurried out, and she did hurry. Mygan stood as high as Mirel or Morven, and there were no orders or oaths of fealty to protect her. Here the long-faced woman gave a small, satisfied nod. Swan had had to beg to be accepted back into the Blue Aja, and rumor had it that Mygan had been the most insistent on the begging. Morven made her excuses to leave behind Swan, perhaps meaning to catch her up for some reason, but Muriel took one of the stools and engaged in a competition with Migun, who could ignore the other most completely. Egwene did not understand the animosity between the two women. Sometimes people just disliked one another, In any case, it did not make for conversation. Egwene took the opportunity to leaf through the pages in Swan's folders, but she could not concentrate on rumors out of Elon and innuendos out of Kyrie. There seemed nothing to account for Theoden's claim. Of a tale that had set the yellow sitters buzzing, Swan would have said something. If she had known Myggan and Myrelle stared at her as if watching her turn over sheets of paper was the most interesting activity in the world, she would have sent them both away. But she wanted to find out what Myrelle had been thinking about. The day Shadar log had been scooped out of the earth, she could not send one away, without sending both, drat the pair of them, when Swan returned with a wooden tray, holding a silver teapot and porcelain cups, and Myggan's white-glazed honey jar. She was followed into the tent by a soldier in plate and mail armor, a young Shinneran with his hair shaved off, except for a topknot. Young but not young Rhaegon's dark cheek carried a puckered white scar from an arrow, and his face was hard in the way only the face of a man who lived with death every hour could be hard. As Swan distributed teacups, he bowed one hand, holding a moon-crested helmet on his hip, the other on his sword hilt. Nothing in his expression said he had ever met her before. "Honor to serve Mother," he said formally. "Lord Bren sent me, he said, to tell you that it seems the raiders may have crossed too. This side of the river last night with Aes Sedai. Lord Bryn is doubling the patrols, he advises, that sisters stay close to the camp to avoid incidents. May I be excused?" Mother Swan said suddenly with the slightly abashed sound of a woman who found herself with an urgent need for the Jake yes, yes, I said as impatiently as she could manage, and barely waited for the other woman to dash out of the tent before going on. "Tell Lord Bryn that Aes Sedai go where they wish, when they wish." She snapped her mouth shut before she could call him Ragun, but that only served to make her seem severe. She hoped it did. "I will tell him, Mother," he replied, making another bow heart and soul to serve. Myggan smiled faintly as he departed. She deprecated soldiers. Warders were good and necessary. Soldiers made messes for others to clean up, in her opinion. But she did favor anything that seemed to indicate a wedge between Egwene and Gareth Bryn, or perhaps better to say that Lion favored in this. Myggan was Laen's woman. To her toenails, Myrelle merely looked puzzled. She knew that I got on well with Lord Gareth. Egwene got up and poured herself a cup of tea, and took a touch of Myggan's honey. Her hands were quite steady. The boats were in place in a few hours. Lyanna would gather Boda and ride well away from the camp before explaining what they were going to do. Lena must take the punishment she had earned, and Boda must do what needed doing. Egwene had been younger than Boda when she was set to hunt Black Sisters. Shinar served their war against the Shadow in the Blightheart and Soul Aes Sedai and those who would become Aes Sedai served the tower, a stronger weapon against the Shadow than any sword, and no less sharp to an unwary hand when Romanda arrived with Theoden to hold open the entry flap for her. The grey-haired Yellow made a very exact curtsy, neither a fraction more nor less than propriety required, from sitter to Armelin. They were not in the hall now. If the Armelin was only first among equals, there she was a little more in her own study. Even for Randa she did not offer to kiss Egwene's ring, though there were limits. She eyed Myrelle and Myggan, as if thinking of asking them to leave, or perhaps telling them it was a prickly point. Sitters expected obedience, but neither was of her AI, and this was the Armelin's study. In the end she did. Neither merely allowed Theoden to take her cloak embroidered with borders of yellow flowers and pour her a cup of tea. Theoden did not have to be asked to do either, and she retreated to a corner, twitching her shawl and her mouth set sullenly. As Romanda took the empty stool, despite the stool's uneven legs, Randa managed to make it seem a seat in the hall of the tower, or maybe a throne, as she adjusted the yellow-fringed shawl she had worn beneath her cloak. "The talks are going badly," she said in that high musical voice she still made it. "Sound a proclamation." Villain is chewing her lips in frustration. Margla is frustrated too, for that matter, and even Sroya. When Sroya starts grinding her teeth, most sisters would be shouting. Excepting Janna, every sitter who had held the chair before the tower divided had insinuated herself into the negotiations. They were talking with women they had known in the hall back then. After all, Bayonine was nearly reduced to running errands. Romanda touched the tea to her lips, then held the cup out to one side on its dish without saying a word. Theoden darted from the corner to take the cup over to the tray, adding honey, before she returned the cup to the sitter, and herself to the corner. Romanda tasted the tea again and nodded in approval. Theoden's face colored. The talks will go as they go, Egwene said carefully. Romanda had opposed any sort of negotiations, spurious or not, and she knew what was to happen tonight. Keeping the hall in the dark about that had seemed a needless slap in the face. The tight bun on the back of Randa's head bobbed as she nodded. They have shown us one thing already, Elida won't allow the sitters speaking for her to budge an inch. She is dug into the tower like a rat in a wall. The only way to flush her is to send ferrets in, after her Myrrel made a sound in her throat, earning a surprised glance from Mygan. Rowanda's eyes remained steady on Egwene's. Elida will be removed one way or another, Egwene said calmly, setting her teacup down on its dish. Her hand did not shake. What had the women learned? How Romanda grimaced faintly at her tea, as if, after all, it lacked sufficient honey, or in disappointment that Egwene had not said more. The woman shifted on her stool, with the air of a swordswoman setting herself for another attack blade, coming up. The things you've said about the kin, mother. That there are over 1,000 of them, rather than a few dozen, that some are 500 or 600 years old. She shook her head over the impossibility. How could all of that have escaped the tower? She was challenging, not asking a question. We only recently learned how many wilders there are among the sea folk, Egwene replied gently. And we still aren't sure how many there really are. Romanda's grimace was not so small this time. It had been the yellow that first confirmed hundreds of seafolk wielders in Elon alone. First blow to Egwene. One blow was not enough to finish Romanda, though, or even to wound her very badly. We will have to hunt them down once our business is done here, she said in grim tones. Letting a few dozen remain in Abuar and Tarvalen just to help us trace runaways was one thing, but we cannot allow 1,000 wielders to remain organized. She put even more contempt into the word, into the idea of wielders organizing, than she did into the rest. Myrrel and Mygun were watching closely. Listening, Mygun was even leaning forward. She was so intent neither knew more than the stories I had spread, which everyone assumed came through Swan's eyes and ears. Well over 1,000, Egwene corrected, and not one wilder. All women sent away from the tower, except for a few runaways who evaded capture. She did not raise her voice, but she made each point firmly meeting Romanda's gaze in any case. How do you propose to hunt them down? They are spread through every country, in every sort of occupation. Ebuta was the only place they ever gathered or met other than by chance. And all those fled when the Shakan came. Since the Trollic Wars, the kin have allowed the tower to know only what they wanted. Known 2,000 years hiding under the White Tower's nose, their numbers have grown while the tower's numbers dwindled. How do you propose to find them now among all the wilders out there that the tower has always ignored because they were too old to become novices as kins? Women don't stand out in any way, Romanda. They use the power almost as often as I said, but they show age like anyone else, if more slowly. If they want to remain hidden, we will never be able to find them. And that was several more blows for Egwene, with none taken. Romanda wore a faint sheen of sweat on her forehead, a sure sign of desperation. In an eyes, Myrrel was sitting very still, but Mygan seemed about to fall off her stool onto her nose, no matter how steady it was. Randa licked her lips. If they channel, they would achieve the look. If they age, they cannot be channeling very often, if at all, and neither way could they live 500 or 600 years. No more dissimulation. It seemed there is only one real difference between Aes and the kin, Egwene said quietly. The words still seemed loud. Even Randa appeared to be holding her breath. They left the White Tower before they could swear on the oath rod. There it was in the open. Finally Randa jerked as if she had taken a mortal blow. You've not taken the oaths yet, she said hoarsely. Do you mean to abandon them, to ask sisters to abandon them? Muriel or Mygan gasped. Perhaps both. No, I said sharply. The 3 oaths are what make us Aes Sedai, and I will swear on the oath rod as soon as it is ours. Drawing a deep breath. She modulated her tone, but she leaned toward the other woman too. Trying to draw her in, to include her, to convince her, she almost stretched out a hand. As it is, sisters, retire to spend their last years in quiet Rwanda. Wouldn't it be better if those were not their last years? If sisters retired into the kin, they could tie the kin to the tower. There would be no need for a futile hunt. Then she had gone this far. She might as well go the last step. The oath rod can unbind as well as bind. Amegan thudded to the carpets on her knees and scrambled up, brushing at her skirts as indignantly as if she had been pushed. Myral's olive face looked a little pale. Moving slowly, Ramanda set her teacup on the edge of the writing table and stood drawing her shawl around her expressionless. She stood staring down at Egwene, while Theodrin settled her yellow embroidered cloak on her shoulders, fastened the golden pin, and arranged the folds as carefully as any lady's maid. Only then did Ramanda speak in a voice like stone. When I was a little girl I dreamed of becoming eyes from the day I reached the White Tower. I tried to live as an Aes Sedai. I have lived as eyes and I will die as eyes. This cannot be allowed. She turned smoothly to go, but she knocked over the stool she had been sitting on. Apparently without noticing, Theoden hurried out after her with concern on her face, oddly enough. "Mother." Myrelle drew a deep breath, fingers plucking at her deep green skirts. "Mother, are you really suggesting?" She trailed off, apparently unable to say it. Megan sat on her stool as though forcing herself not to lean forward again. "I have laid out the facts," Egwene said calmly. "Any decision will be the halls tell me, daughter. Would you choose to die when you could live and continue to serve the tower?" The green sister and the blue exchanged glances, then realized what they had done and snapped back to ignoring one another. Neither answered, but Egwene could almost see the thoughts churning behind their eyes. After a few moments, she got up and set the stool back upright. Even that failed to rouse them further than perfunctory apologies for making her see of that herself. Then they lapsed into silent reflection. She tried to return to the pages in Swan's folders. The stalemate at the Stone of Tyr was dragging on, and no one admitted to any idea of how it would end. But not long after Ramanda's departure, Elayne arrived. Unlike Ramanda, the slender blue sitter was alone and poured her own tea, settling onto the empty stool. She tossed her fur-lined cloak back over both shoulders and let it hang from a silver cloak pin set with large sapphires. She wore her shawl too. Sitters usually did. Elayne was more direct than Randa, or so it might have seemed on the surface. Her eyes held a sharp glitter. Kern's death put another crimp in the chances of making any sort of agreement with the Black Tower. She murmured over her teacup, inhaling the fumes. "And then there's poor Cleo to deal with. Perhaps Myrelle will take him. 2 of her 3 belong to someone else first. No one else has ever saved. 2 warders whose eyes died." Egwene was not the only one to hear special emphasis in that Myrrel's face. Definitely polled she had 2 secrets to hide, and one was that she had 4 warders. The passing of Lan Mandran's bond from Maine to her had been something not done in hundreds of years. Today it was looked upon like bonding a man against his will, something not done in even more hundreds of years. 3 is enough for me," she said breathlessly. "If you will excuse me, Mother." Megan laughed softly as Muriel left the tent, walking fast. Not so fast that she failed to embrace Saidea before the entry flaps fell. "Though, of course," Elayne said, exchanging amused looks with the other blue. "They say she marries her warders, all of them. Perhaps poor Slew won't do for a husband." "He is as wide as a horse," Megan put in. Despite her amusement over Myrelle's flight, there was no maliciousness in her voice. She was simply stating a fact. Cleo was a very large man. "I think I know a young blue who might take him. She isn't interested in men that way." Elayne nodded in a way that said the young blue had found her warder. Greens can be very odd. Take Elayne tanned, for example. Actually, I never thought Elayne would choose green. I had her marked out for the blue. The girl has a deaf feel for the currents in politics, though she also has a tendency to wander into deeper water than might be safe, wouldn't you say so? Mother smiling, she sipped at her tea. This was not at all like Randa's subtle feeling out. This was slash and slash with the blade appearing out of nowhere. Did Elayne know about Myrelle and Lan? Had she sent someone to Camlin? And if so, how much had she learned? Egwene wondered whether Randa had also felt off balance and dazed. "Do you think Karen's murder is enough to stop an agreement?" She said. "For all anyone knows, this could be low gain, returning for some mad revenge. Why in the light had she said that she needed to put a rein on her tongue and keep her wits, or more likely some poor fool from a farm around here, or one of the bridge towns?" Elayne's smile deepened, and it was mocking, not amused light. The woman had not shown this much disrespect in months. "If Lone wanted revenge, Mother, I suspect he would be in the White Tower trying to kill Reds." Despite her smile, her voice was smooth and level, a disturbing contrast. Perhaps that was her intention. "Perhaps it's a pity he isn't doing that. He might remove Elida, but that would be easier than she deserves. No, Charon won't stop an agreement any more than Anaya did. But the two combined will make sisters worry even harder about safeguards and strictures. We may need these men, but we must be certain we are in control, complete control. Egwene nodded a small nod. She agreed, but there might be difficulties bringing them to accept that she said. Difficulties. She was displaying a positive talent for understatement. Today the water bond could be modified slightly. Mygon said, "As it is, you can make the man do as you wish with a little tweaking, but the need to tweak could be removed quite easily." "That sounds too much like compulsion," Egwene said firmly. She had learned that weave from Mogadeen, but only to work on how to counter it. The thing was filth, the theft of another person's will, of their whole being. Someone who was compelled, did anything you ordered, anything, and believed it was their own choice. Just thinking about it made her feel dirty. Megan met her gaze almost as levelly as Elayne had, though, and her voice was as smooth as her face. She had no thoughts of filth. Compulsion was used on sisters in Sharon. That seems certain now, but I was talking about the bond, a different thing entirely. You think you can talk the Ashaman into accepting the bond? Egwene could not keep the incredule out of her voice. Aside from that, who is going to do this bonding? Even if every sister who doesn't have a warder took an Ashaman, and every green took 2 or 3, there aren't enough. Sisters, that's if you can find one who doesn't mind being bonded to a man who is going to go mad. Megan nodded at each point, as if accepting it, and adjusted her skirts as if not really listening. "If the bond can be changed in one way," she said, "once I finished it, should be possible to change it in others. There might be a way to remove the sharing, perhaps some of the awareness. Then perhaps the madness would not be a problem. It would be a different sort of bond. Not like the water bond at all. I'm certain everyone will agree it wouldn't. Be like having a warder, really. Any sister could bond whatever number of Ashaman was necessary abruptly." Egwene realized what was happening. Elayne sat apparently peering into her teacup, but she was studying Egwene through her eyelashes and using Mygon as a stalking horse smothering anger. Egwene did not have to make her voice cold. It was ice that sounds exactly like compulsion. Lila, it is compulsion, and no twisting of words will make it anything else. I will point that out to anyone else who suggests this, and I will order the birch for anyone who does more than suggest. Compulsion is banned, and it will remain banned, as you say. Elayne replied, which might have meant anything at all. What came next was more pointed. The White Tower makes mistakes upon occasion. It is impossible to live or move without making mistakes, but we live and we go on, and if we sometimes need to conceal our mistakes whenever possible, we rectify them even when it is painful. Putting her cup back on the tray, she left with Mygon at her heels. Mygon embraced the source before she left the tent. Elayne did not. For a time, Egwene concentrated on keeping her breathing steady. She performed the river contained by the bank lane, had not quite said that Egwene Alvier, as Armlin, was a mistake that might have to be rectified, but she had come very close at midday. Chessa brought Egwene's meal on another wooden tray, warm crusty bread with only 1 or 2 suspiciously dark flexics, and lentil stew, with slivers of tough turnip and woody carrot, and bits of something that might have been goat. 1 spoonful was all I could get down. It was not Elayne that troubled her. Elayne had threatened her before, if not since. She made it clear that she was the Armelin and not a puppet instead of eating. She stared at Tiana's report lying to the side of the table. Nicola might not have gained the shawl in spite of her potential, but the Tower had long experience in taking mule-headed, fault-ridden women and turning them into confident eyes. Sedai Lena had a bright future ahead of her, but she had to learn to obey the rules before she could begin learning which could be broken, and when the White Tower was good at teaching. Both things, but the first always came first. Bodha's future would be brilliant, her potential almost equal, but I accepted, or novice, the Tower required you to do what was needed for the Tower. Aes Sedai accepted novice, or Armelin chases, was valuable in her disappointment, when she returned to find the tray almost untouched, especially after she had found a practically untouched breakfast. Egwene considered claiming an upset stomach, and rejected it after Chassa's tea worked on her headaches at least for a few days, until they returned fiercer than ever. And every night the plump woman had turned, out to have a collection of herbal remedies for every ill purchased from every peddler with a glib tongue, and each vile tasting than the last. She had a way of looking so downhearted when you would not drink the awful mixtures that you found yourself swallowing them just to keep her from worrying. Sometimes, surprisingly, they worked, but they were never anything Egwene wanted to put in her mouth. She sent Chassa away with the tray and a promise to eat later. No doubt Chassa would present a supper big enough to stuff a goose. She felt like smiling at the thought Chassa would stand over her, wringing her hands till she ate every bite. But her eyes fell back on Tiana's report. Nicola Lena and Bota the White Tower was a strict taskmistress. Unless the tower is at war by consensus of the hall, the Armerlin shall not. But the tower was at war. She did not know how long she sat staring at that piece of paper with one name on it. But when Swan returned, she had made up her mind, a strict taskmistress who never played favorites. "Have Lyanna and Bota gone?" she asked. At least 2 hours ago, Mother Lyanna had to deliver Bota and then ride down. Stone Egwene was Armerland now, not anyone. Swan, now go on, go and hurry. Forehead still creased. Swan hurried as soon as she was alone. Egwene slid the stole from her neck, folded it carefully, and tucked it into her belt pouch. Her cloak was good wool and stout, but quite plain without the stole dangling from her cowl. She could have been anyone. The walkway in front of her study was empty, of course, but once she crossed the frozen street, she made her way through the usual white river of novices, speckled with accepted, and the occasional eyes said the novices bent. Knees to her without slowing, the accepted offered curtsies as she passed. Once they saw that the skirts beneath her cloak were not banded white, and the eyes had glided along with their own faces, hidden by their cowls, if any noticed that she was not followed by a warder. Well, a number of sisters lacked warders, and not everyone was surrounded by the glowing nimbus of Cedar. Just most 2 streets from her study, she stopped at the edge of the wooden walkway, facing away from the stream of hurrying women. She tried not to fret the sunset. Her disarrayed cowl back into place. Swan opened her mouth too, but Egwene held up a warning hand before the other woman could speak. She could see the word mother forming on Swan's lips, and likely it would have been loud enough to be heard 50 paces off. "Tell no one," I said softly, "and no notes or hints either that should cover everything. Keep Chaser company till I get back. I don't want her worried." Swan gave a reluctant nod. Her mouth almost looked sullen. Egwene suspected she had been wise to add notes and hints, leaving the one-time Armerlin seat looking like a sulky girl. She climbed smoothly into Bella's saddle. She had to walk the stout mare at first, because of the frozen ruts in the camp streets, and because everyone would wonder if they saw Swan riding Bella at anything faster than a walk. She tried to ride like Swan, swaying uncertainly, clinging to the saddle's tall pummel with one hand, and sometimes both. It made her feel as if she were about to fall off too. Bella twisted her head around to look at her. She knew who was on her back, and she knew Egwene rode better than this. Egwene continued to imitate Swan and tried not to think about where the sun stood all the way out of the camp, beyond the rows of wagons, until the first trees hid her from tents and wagons. Then she bent over the pummel to press her face into Bella's mane. "You carried me away from the 2 rivers," she whispered. "Can you run as fast now?" Straightening, she dug in her heels. Bella could not gallop like Daishar, but her sturdy legs churned through the snow. She had been a cart horse once, not a racer or warrior, but she gave what she had, stretching out her neck, as bravely as Daishar ever could. Bella raced, and the sun slid slower, as if the sky had suddenly become greased. Egwene lay low in the saddle and urged the mare on a race with the sun that I knew she could not win. But even if she could not beat the sun, there was still time. She thumped her heels in time with Bella's hooves, and Bella ran. Twilight rolled over them, and then darkness before Egwene saw the moon glinting on the water of the Arryn still time. It was almost the spot where she had sat Daishar with Gareth, watching the river ship slide toward Tarvalin, reining Bella in. She listened, stillness, and then a muffled curse. The quiet grunts and scrapes of men dragging a heavy burden across the snow and trying for silence. She turned Bella through the trees toward the sound shadows stirred, and she heard the soft whisper of steel sliding from scabbards. Then a man muttered not far enough under his breath, "I know that pony. It's one of the sisters, the one they say used to be Armelin. She doesn't look it to me, no. Older than the one they say is Armelin. Now Bella is not a pony." Egwene said crisply, "Take me to Boda Coffin." A dozen men coalesced out of the night shadows among the trees surrounding her and Bella. They all seemed to think she was Swan, but that was all right to them. Aes Sedai was Aes Sedai, and they guided her to where Boda was sitting, a horse not much taller than Bella, and holding a dark cloak around her. Her dress was dark too. White would have stood out tonight. Boda recognized Bella too and reached out to scratch the mare's ear fondly when Egwene rode up beside her. "You're staying ashore," Egwene said quietly. "You can go back with me when it's done." Boda jerked her hand back as if stung at the sound of Egwene's voice. Why, she said, not quite a demand. She had learned that much. "At least I can do this," Lyanna said. "I explained it to me and I can do it. I know you can, but not as well as I can, not yet." That seemed too much like a criticism that the other woman had not earned. "I am the Armland seat, Boda. Some decisions only I can make, and some things I shouldn't ask a novice to do when I can do them better." Perhaps that was not a great deal milder, but she could not explain about Lena and Nicola, or the price the White Tower demanded of all its daughters. The Armelin could not explain the one to a novice, and a novice was not ready to learn about the other, even in the night. The set of Boda's shoulders said she did not understand, but she had learned not to argue with Edai too, just as she had learned that I was Aesai. The rest she would learn. Eventually the tower could take all the time it needed to teach her dismounting. Egwene handed Bella's reins to one of the soldiers and raised her skirts to through the snow toward the labored sounds of dragging. It was a large rowboat being pushed and pulled across the snow like a sled. A bulky sled that had to be maneuvered between trees, though with fewer curses, once the men doing the pushing and pulling realized that she was following them closely. Most men guarded their tongues around Aesai, and if they could not see her face between the darkness and her cowl, who else would be down here by the river if they knew she was not the same woman intended at first to accompany them? Who questioned Edai? They eased the boat into the river, careful of splashes, and 6 men scrambled aboard to set oars in rag-padded oarlocks. The men went barefoot to avoid the noise of a boot scraping on the hull planks. Smaller boats pied these waters, but tonight they had to master the currents. One of the men on the bank gave her a hand to steady herself. Climbing in, and she settled on a seat in the bow, holding her cloak. Close, the boat slid away from the bank, silent except for the faint swirl of the oars in the water. Egwene looked ahead south toward Tarvalin. The white walls gleamed in the light of a fat, waning moon, and lamplit windows gave the city a muted glow, almost as if the island was embracing Sidar. The white tower stood out even in the darkness. Windows alight, the great mass shining beneath the moon. Something flashed across the moon, and her breath caught for an instant. She thought it had been a Drea. An evil sight on this of all nights. Only a bat, she decided spring might be near enough for bats to be venturing out. Pulling her cloak tighter, she peered toward the city, drawing nearer. As the tall wall of North Harbour loomed in front of the boat, the oarsman backed water, so the bow just missed kissing the wall beside the harbour entrance. Egwene almost put out a hand to fend off from the pale stone before the boat could bump into the wall. That thump would surely have been heard by the soldiers on guard. The oars made only a small gurgling noise as they swept back through, and the boat stopped, where she could have touched the massive iron chain across the harbour, its huge links giving off their own faint gleam from the grease coating them. There was no need for touching, though no need for waiting. Either embracing Sedea, she was barely aware of the thrill of life filling her. Before she had the weaves in place, earth, fire, and air surrounding the chain, earth and fire touching it, the black iron flashed to white across the whole width of the harbour mouth. She had just time to realize that someone had embraced the source not far away above her on the wall. Then something struck. The boat struck her, and she was aware of cold water enveloping her, filling her nose. Her mouth darkness. Egwene felt hardness beneath her. She heard women's voices, excited voices. "Do you know who this is?" Well, we certainly got better than we bargained for tonight." Something was pressed to her mouth and warmth trickled in, tasting faintly of mint. She swallowed convulsively, suddenly aware of how cold she was, shivering. Her eyes flickered open and fastened on the face of the woman holding her head, and the cup lanterns held by soldiers crowding around gave light enough for her to make out the face clearly. An ageless face. She was inside North Harbor. "That's it, girl," the eyes said. I said encouragingly. "Drink it all down." Strong dose for now. Egwene tried to push the cup away, tried to embrace Cedar, but she could feel herself sliding back down into darkness. They had been waiting for her. She had been betrayed, but by whom? Epilogue and answer ran. Stared out of the window at the steady rain falling out of a grey sky. Another storm done out of the spine of the world. The dragon wall, he thought. Spring must be coming. Spring always came, eventually, earlier. Here in Tyr than back home it should be, though there seemed little sign of it. Lightning forked silver blue across the sky, and long moments passed before the peal of thunder, distant lightning. The wounds in his side ached like the herons branded into his palms. Ached after all this time. Sometimes pain is all that lets you know you're alive. Loose there, and whispered. But Rand ignored the voice in his head. The door creaked open behind him, and he looked over his shoulder at the man who came into the sitting room. Basher was wearing a short grey silk coat, a rich shimmering coat, and he had the baton of the Marshal General of Salia, an ivory, rod-tipped with a golden wolf's head tucked behind his belt, next to his scabarded sword. His turned-down boots had been waxed till they shone. Rand tried not to let his relief show they had been gone long enough. "Well," he said. "The Shan are amenable," Basher replied. "Crazy as loons, but amenable. They require a meeting with you in person, though the Marshal General of Salia isn't the Dragon Reborn with this Lady Srome."